Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Dream through history tonight. We journey through the cruel rhythms of feudal life, where suffering was ordinary and survival, a quiet revolution. Close your eyes and step back in time to a world where freedom was a myth and power belonged to the few. You are not a knight or a noble. You're a serf born into bondage, bound to the soil, and owned like livestock. Every harvest you reap is claimed by your lord. Every tool you touch, taxed. You cannot marry without permission. You cannot leave without punishment. This is the forgotten reality of medieval Europe, not castles and chivalry, but chains and cold silence. From brutal taxes to futile rebellions, from grueling labor to the glimmers of escape. Part 1. Born into bondage, the world of the serf for the vast majority in medieval Europe. Birth defined destiny. Serfs were bound to the land, owned by the manor lord. They farmed his fields, paid his dues, and lived under his judgments with no freedom to leave or marry without permission. Every grain belonged to someone else. Manorialism, also known as sycamorialism, the manor system or system, was the method of land ownership or tenure in parts of Europe, notably France and later England during the Middle Ages. Its defining features included a large, sometimes fortified manor house in which the lord of the manor and his dependents lived and administered a rural estate, and a population of laborers or serfs who worked the surrounding land to support themselves and the lord. These laborers fulfilled their obligations with labor time or in-kind produce at first, and later by cash payment as commercial activity increased. Manorialism was part of the feudal system. Manorialism originated in the Roman villa system of the late Roman Empire, and was widely practiced in medieval Western Europe and parts of Central Europe, an essential element of feudal society. Manorialism was slowly replaced by the advent of a money-based market economy and new forms of agrarian contract. Manorialism faded away slowly and piecemeal, along with its most vivid feature in the landscape, the open field system. It outlasted serfdom in the sense that it continued with freehold laborers. As an economic system, it outlasted feudalism, according to Andrew Jones, because it could maintain a warrior, but it could equally well maintain a capitalist landlord. It could be self-sufficient, yield produce for the market, or it could yield a money rent. The last feudal dues in France were abolished at the French Revolution. In parts of eastern Germany, the Rittergut manors of Junkers remained until World War II. Historical and geographical distribution. The term is most often used with reference to medieval Western Europe. Antecedents of the system can be traced to the rural economy of the later Roman Empire dominate. Labor was the key factor of production. Successive administrations tried to stabilize the imperial economy by freezing the social structure into place. Sons were to succeed their fathers in their trade. Councillors were forbidden to resign, and coloni, the cultivators of land, were not to move from the land they were attached to. The workers of the land were on their way to becoming serfs. Several factors conspired to merge the status of former slaves and former free farmers into a dependent class of such colony. It was possible to be described as servus et, both slave and colonus. The laws of Constantine I, around 325, both reinforced the semi-servile status of the colony and limited their rights to sue in the courts. The Codex Theodosianus, promulgated under Theodosius II, extended these restrictions. The legal status of adscripti, bound to the soil, contrasted with barbarian foederati, who were permitted to settle within the imperial boundaries, remaining subject to their own traditional law. as the Germanic kingdoms succeeded Roman authority in the West in the 5th century. Roman landlords were often simply replaced by Germanic ones, with little change to the underlying situation or displacement of populations. The process of rural self-sufficiency was given an abrupt boost in the 8th century, when normal trade in the Mediterranean Sea was disrupted. The word derives from traditional, inherited divisions of the countryside, reassigned as local jurisdictions known as manors or seigneuries, each manor being subject to a lord, French seigneur, usually holding his position in return for undertakings offered to a higher lord. See feudalism. The lord held a manorial court, governed by public law and local custom. Not all territorial seigneurs were secular. Bishops and abbots also held lands that entailed similar obligations. By extension, the word manor is sometimes used in England as a slang term for any home, area, or territory in which authority is held, often in a police or criminal context. In the generic plan of a medieval manor from Shepherd's Historical Atlas, the strips of individually worked land in the open field system are immediately apparent. In this plan, the manor house is set slightly apart from the village, but equally often the village grew up around the forecourt of the manor, formerly walled, while the manor lands stretched away outside, as still may be seen at Petworth House. As concerns for privacy dubious discuss increased in the 18th century, citation-needed manor houses were often located a farther distance from the village. For example, when a grand new house was required by the new owner of Harloxton Manor, Lincolnshire, in the 1830s, the site of the existing manor house at the edge of its village was abandoned for a new one, isolated in its park, with the village out of view. Citation needed in an agrarian society. The conditions of land tenure underlie all social or economic factors. There were two legal systems of premanorial landholding. One, the most common, was the system of holding land alone in full outright ownership. The other was a use of praecaria or benefices, in which land was held conditionally, the root of the English word precarious. To these two systems, the Carolingian monarchs added a third, the appricio, which linked manorialism with feudalism. The appricio made its first appearance in Charlemagne's province of Septimania in the south of France, when Charlemagne had to settle the Visigothic refugees who had fled with his retreating forces after the failure of his Zaragoza expedition of 778. He solved this problem by allotting desert tracts of uncultivated land belonging to the royal fisc under direct control of the emperor. These holdings, appricio, entailed specific conditions. The earliest specific appricio grant that has been identified was at Font-Joncas, near Narbonne-Louis, Links. In former Roman settlements, a system of villas, dating from late antiquity, was inherited by the medieval world. The possessor of a seigneury bears the title of lord. He can be an individual, in the vast majority of cases a national of the nobility or of the bourgeoisie, but also a judicial person, most often an ecclesiastical institution such as an abbey, a cathedral, or canonical chapter, or a military order. The power of the lord was exercised through various intermediaries, the most important of which was the bailiff. The sovereign can also be a lord. The seigneuries he owns form the royal domain. The title of lord is also granted, especially in modern times, to individuals holding noble fiefdoms, which are not for all that these lords are sometimes called sieurs. Equivalent terms in medieval times. The landlordship. The landlordship, the lord is the direct or prominent owner of the land assets of his lordship. The notion of absolute ownership over a common good cannot be applied, because there are also others, than the main user who have rights over these goods. We who distinguish in the landlordship to sets the reserves, which is the set of goods of which the lord reserves the direct exploitation, and tenant-in-chief, property whose exploitation is entrusted to a tenant against payment of a royalty, most often called essage, and services such as corvée. The distribution between reserve and tenure varies depending on the period and region. Manors each consisted of up to 3 classes of land: domain, the part directly controlled by the lord and used for the benefit of his household and dependents; dependents, serf or villein holdings, carrying the obligation that the peasant household supply the lord with specified labor services or a part of its output or cash in lieu thereof, subject to the custom attached to the holding; and free peasant land, without such obligation but otherwise subject to manorial jurisdiction and custom, and owing money rent fixed at the time of the lease. Additional sources of income for the lord included charges for use of his mill, bakery, or wine press, or for the right to hunt or to let pigs feed in his woodland, as well as court revenues and single payments on each change of tenant. On the other side of the account, manorial administration involved significant expenses, perhaps a reason why smaller manors tended to rely less on villein tenure. Original research: dependent holdings were held nominally by arrangement of lord and tenant, but tenure became in practice almost universally hereditary, with a payment made to the lord on each succession of another member of the family. Villein land could not be abandoned, at least until demographic and economic circumstances made flight a viable proposition. Nor could they be passed to a third party without the lord's permission and the customary payment. Although not free, villeins were by no means in the same position as slaves. They enjoyed legal rights, subject to local custom, and had recourse to the law subject to court charges, which were an additional source of manorial income. Subletting of villein holdings was common, and labor on the domain might be commuted into an additional money payment. As happened increasingly from the 13th century, land which was neither let to tenants nor formed part of domain lands was known as waste. Typically, this included hedges, verges, etc. Common land, where all members of the community had right of passage, was known as lord's waste. Part of the domain land of the manor, which being uncultivated, was termed the lord's waste, and served for public roads and for common pasture to the lord and his tenants. In many settlements during the early modern period, illegal building was carried out on lord's waste land by squatters who would then plead their case to remain, with local support. An example of a lord's waste settlement where the main centres grew up in this way is the village of Bredfield in Suffolk. Lord's waste continues to be a source of rights and responsibilities, issues in places such as Henley and Edon, Warwickshire. In examining the origins of the monastic cloister, Walter Horn found that, as a manorial entity, the Carolingian monastery ... differed little from the fabric of a feudal estate, save that the corporate community of men for whose sustenance this organization was maintained consisted of monks who served God in chant and spent much of their time in reading and writing. Evil customs, Catalan, mals, USOs, lit. Bad uses were specific medieval feudal customs, generally levies, which peasants were subjected to by their feudal lords in the Crown of Aragon and other European countries. These obligations are related to the use malatractandi, a right approved by the Catalan court of 1358, which empowered the feudal lords to treat their people in ways later considered unjust. In the Principality of Catalonia, the population was controlled by the feudal nobility, and a number of benefits were established that would later be considered evil customs. The customs were most often found in relation to the land of the so-called Old Catalonia. The ties of the peasant to the land he worked required him to pay a redemption if he wanted to leave it. The usages of Barcelona collected only three of the most common obligations: the intestia, cugucia, and the evil customs with the possibility of being redeemed, paying a tribute to the Lord in the Sentencia Arbitral de Guadalupe, were intestia, a right of nobles to confiscate of a portion, generally a third, of the property of peasants who died without making a will. Pella and Forgas said that this abuse occurred almost in general in the diocese of Girona, if it was a younger man who died intestate and without children. The lord of the manor received a third of it, and the rest of it was distributed for various purposes, some for the family, some for the church, to pray for the soul of the deceased, or as alms for the poor. Axorquia, law by which the feudal lord received 1/3 of the inheritance of the peasant who had no descendants. Cugucia, if the peasant's wife was found guilty of adultery, the feudal lord received half of her dowry if the woman had the consent of her husband, or the whole of her dowry if the woman did not. Arcia, indemnification of the peasant who had to pay the feudal lord in case of accidental fire of his belongings. Firma of forced plunder, the extraction of a part of the goods of the peasants when they guaranteed the dowry of the woman with the farm of their feudal lord. After the marriage of his vassals, the peasant had the useful domain and the feudal lord had the direct dominion, personal freedom. The peasants, subject to servitude, could not leave the farm they worked without having been redeemed by their feudal lord. Emancipation did not only affect the peasant, but also his wife and, above all, his children. The price of freedom varied greatly over time and were in line with the valuation of the farm. The incorruptible maidens were redeemed by paying their feudal lord a fixed amount. In the diocese of Girona, this was to sueldos and 8 dineros. In addition to these evil customs, other manorial customs existed, including forge of distress. The peasant was obliged to repair his work tools in the forge of the feudal lord. It was a noble monopoly on blacksmithing. Obligation of the mill. The peasant was obliged to grind their corn in a mill belonging to the feudal lord. Obligation of the furnace. The peasant was obliged to bake their bread in an oven belonging to the feudal lord, especially on lands with a concentrated population. Obligation of the yoke. Jova. The peasant was obliged to plough the feudal lord's land with his oxen on a yoke during certain determined days of the year. Obligation of manipulation. The peasant was obliged to work corn or any other product belonging to the feudal lord. Another custom that did not only oppress peasants but also humiliated them was the provision of arbitrary labor services. These included the use of a nursing woman to become a wet nurse for the lord's children. Crown of Castile. The Crown of Castile. It is difficult to determine what the evil customs were, since the region was more subject to the oral tradition. Reference is made to the so-called bad fueros, feudal regimes, harder in benefits. As Castile tried to attract people from other areas or kingdoms, the fueros or laws were rarely harsh. The evil customs were sporadic or were simply monetary payments. Some examples include assignment of the peasant to the land, preventing him from abandoning it, banalities such as the obligation to use the mill or oven belonging to the feudal lord with the previous payment of a fee, take out bread in France and in Castile. For example, it was forbidden to take the grain out of the feudal lordship to avoid scarcity and speculation. However, in Castile, it could be done with the previous payment of a fee. The third, it was the obligation of the peasant to take over the administration of the property of the feudal lord. This burden meant hard obligations, among other things, to replace any loss with the peasants' personal patrimony. This custom was banned by King Henry IV of Castile. The privilege of the corral allowed the feudal lord to seize birds, calves, and all type of cattle without milk. If the wife of the feudal lord had a child and could not breastfeed him, the feudal lords selected peasant women who had recently had a child and forced them to go to the castle to breastfeed their children. Abolition. The abolition of the evil or bad customs took a long time, and this could primarily be attributed to the way that it formed part of the identity of the serfs, serving as an essential element in the definition of their servile bond and legal status as subordinate to the lords. Before the series of peasant revolts that stemmed from the jus malactrandi, there were already attempts on the part of the royal courts to eliminate this system of servitude. For instance, Maria de Luna, Queen of Aragon Catalonia, began raising the issue sometime in the 15th century. She appealed to Pope Benedict XIII, her kinsman, citing the example of Christ agi exemplum crucifixi, who freed people from their bondage. King John I was also against the system and planned to procure its abolition shortly before his death in 1395. The evil customs became one of the causes of the Catalan Civil War, which took place between the years 1460 and 1486, the year in which they were abolished by King Ferdinand II of Aragon. He issued the Sentencia Arbitral de Guadalupe, which scrapped the evil customs with a previous payment of 60 salaries per farm, and abolished the right to mistreat and many other minor landed abuses. The peasants maintained the useful domain of the farms, but they had to pay homage to the feudal lord and pay the feudal rights. Peasants in feudal England, no pay, no rights, led to the revolt of 1381. Sure, we can complain about our modern work arrangements, noisy open offices, unpaid internships, extra hours, and abusive managers, but thanks to an almost forgotten medieval uprising of serfs, we've all benefited from basic economic rights that are now taken for granted. In the late 14th century, Wat Tyler led the English peasantry in a revolt against the harsh work life of the feudal manor. Their battle cry was ending oppressive laws that forced serfs to work for free and extracted from them an endless stream of fees and charges. Tyler's call for equal treatment for all continues to engage us to this day. Protests supporting economic equality and civil rights for the disenfranchised spread quickly. Religious leaders take up the cause, and the movement gains sympathizers. Mass protests electrify the nation as marchers stream into cities, gaining new followers with their powerful message. Governments at the local and the national level are surprised and fearful of what might come next as news of property damage and violent encounters reaches the highest levels of leadership. The US in 2020, or perhaps 1968? Emphatically not. With a little poetic license, I'm instead referring to one of the most overlooked rebellions in Western history, known as the Great Peasants' Revolt, or Wat Tyler's Rebellion. It took place over a few weeks in the summer of 1381, involving tens of thousands of English serfs whose legal status was barely above the level of slaves. Their goal was an end to English feudalism and its oppressive hierarchical structure, to use force as necessary to gain a commitment from the aristocracy for equal rights and payment for work under fair contracts. Effectively, the rebels hoped to tear down the foundations of an economic system that had lasted for centuries. It was a system, though, that kept this mostly agrarian population at subsistence levels, while a small group of landed aristocrats lived comfortably off the farmers' toil. the manor lords ignored their essential workers at their own peril. Among the most striking aspects of the revolt were its suddenness and the organizational abilities of its semi-literate farmers and laborers. Over the course of the rebellion, Wat Tyler, a roof tiler by trade, became a clever military tactician and charismatic political leader. The peasant army was able briefly to paralyze the state before King Richard II's army ultimately struck back. Origins of rebellion. Life on the manor. The revolt can be viewed as a long overdue response to the nature of feudal life in England. To be an English serf, or a serf anywhere in Europe in the late Middle Ages, involved carrying out endless obligations on behalf of his aristocratic master, either through payments in kind from his small farm holdings or through direct labor. 3. Centuries earlier, the Norman conquerors had organized English feudalism, taking land away from the existing Anglo-Saxon lords and dividing it up among the victors. By the time of the rebellion, there were several ways to refer to the unfree peasantry. They could be called villeins, or serfs, from the Latin servus, borders workers with small land holdings, and cotters day labourers. There were also free villeins, but, as we'll see, even the free were still dependent on the feudal structure. English village life was centred around the lord's manor and his own farmland, known as a domain, a French Norman word from which domain comes. Villeins had their own small land holdings where they grew crops and managed livestock, and for which they paid rent as tenants. But they were also required to work the lord's domain. This was unpaid labour and took away from their own heroic efforts to feed themselves. King Richard II meeting with rebels of the peasants' revolt. Painting by John Froissart, c. 15th century. Collection of Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Source: Wikimedia Commons. While skilled and free masons and craftsmen played an important role in the construction of castles and other fortifications, the grunt work of moving and lifting was also done for free, courtesy of the unfree villeins. This forced labour requirement, also known as corvée, was widespread throughout Western Europe, and was a particularly hated aspect of feudalism. The manor lord continually extracted payments from his serf workforce, in addition to renting a few acres of land, which were divvied out into strips or furloughs. The serf paid a yearly tax or tallage. They also made payments of farm goods to their master during important holidays, say, eggs, during Easter and Christmas. Serfs were legally required to use the lord's mill for grinding grain and baking bread in the lord's ovens, for which he paid in flour. If the unfree villeins wanted to live or work outside the village, they needed permission, and another tax, known as chivage, had to be given over as well. A more complete list of all the fees and other obligations of the peasantry, it is mind-numbingly long, can be found here. Better off villeins could avoid feudal labour obligations through cash payments, and ultimately pay their lords to release them from serfdom. The real test of free status, though, was based on whether the villeins had to comply with some of the more intrusive feudal rules. If the villeins didn't need to seek permission to marry outside their own village, pay the death tax or ario, and were able to avoid the annual tallage, then they were considered freemen. The massively unequal relationship between peasant and lord naturally led to minor clashes and sometimes small-scale rebellions. In the 13th century, there were recorded incidents of English peasants refusing to pay the annual tallage or to perform some of the labour services. Sometimes these protests led to court actions or petitions directly to the king, but rarely to violence. The Black Death and serf economics say brief respite from the feudal life came appallingly in the form of the bubonic plague, which reached England in 1348. It's thought that the Black Death killed between 30 to 40% of the English population. Towns and cities, such as London, saw even higher mortality rates. The plague returned to England in 1361 and then again sporadically up until the Great Revolt of 1381. The plague devastated the English economy. There was a far smaller market for goods, and rents to the lords were greatly reduced. But somewhat counterintuitively, it raised the incomes of the remaining villains. With a severe labour shortage, the surviving peasants were able to obtain a premium price for their services. They started calling the shots to take back the new economic powers of the peasantry resulting from the Black Death. King Edward III passed a royal ordinance in 1349 to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. It was widely ignored. The English feudal establishment struck back more definitively with the notorious Statute of Labourers, passed by Parliament in 1351. It was a nationwide law that set wages, limited worker mobility, and also established a strong enforcement mechanism at the local level. Serfs could be imprisoned for violating the statute. Grievances lead to open revolt with the death of Edward III and the ascension of the boy King Richard II to the throne in 1377. The stage was set for the catastrophic uprising. The long-simmering hostilities between the serfs and their lords came to a boil with the new restrictions on the serfs' economic power, as spelled out in the Statute of Labourers. Then a series of ill-conceived poll taxes or head taxes, starting at the end of Edward's reign and continuing with Richard II, further stoked the anger of the peasantry. The English kings needed to fund their war against the French, and these regressive poll taxes required peasants' men and women to hand over far more of their wages than they could afford. In May of 1381, peasants in Essex and Kent began resisting the attempts of the king's tax collectors. Large gatherings formed, and at this time, Wat Tyler emerged as their leader. By early June, the rebels started attacking the properties of the king's representatives. Most significantly, the home in Cressing Temple of Sir Robert Hales, the hated royal treasurer. With the English army away in Scotland, the peasants became emboldened. More villagers began to disobey the tax collectors, refusing to pay the poll tax. When the local courts began issuing indictments, the rebels responded violently, killing jurors and destroying buildings representing the court and legal system, along with the records contained inside. One of Wat Tyler's demands was the freedom for serfs to sell their crop surplus in the marketplace and directly profit from their work. Under feudal rules, surpluses generally belonged to the manor lord. The rebels, now an army led by Tyler, swept into the important Kent town of Canterbury, freeing prisoners held in the castle and burning legal papers in the streets. By this point, King Richard and his advisors back in London had heard news of the rebellion and made initial communication with the rebels. Tyler's immediate goal was to end the poll tax, but the destruction of bureaucratic records was meant as a direct blow to the machinery of the feudal bureaucracy. By the second week, the other key rebel leader, the heretical preacher John Ball, emerged. Ball was already known for his radical religious views, and in his memorable speech at Blackheath addressing the peasant army, he called for an end to all hierarchies, that the lords be no greater master than we. Ball and Tyler led their army to London, where they gained new allies among the urban, unskilled and semi-skilled labourers and other wage earners. While in London, their forces pursued lawyers and destroyed more records, burnt church properties, and beheaded Archbishop Sudbury. The protests were now out of control, but they achieved their goal of frightening Richard. hiding in the Tower of London. King Richard called for a meeting with Tyler and his followers at Mile End. The betrayal at Smithfield, the drama, was now close to its final act. At the field of Mile End, Richard and his advisors met Tyler, who delivered his ultimatum: make all men free forever. Tyler asked for an end to feudal obligations and fees, and particularly for working without pay for the manor lord. The 14-year-old Richard acceded to Tyler's demands, hoping he'd return to Kent, thereby buying time until his soldiers in Scotland could come back and put down the rebellion. Richard's gambit failed, however, and Tyler and his rebels continued to destroy properties and behead ministers and merchants. Blood was truly flowing in the streets of London. Finally, Richard and London's mayor, William Walworth, had enough and set a trap. They agreed to meet Tyler one last time at Smithfield, just outside London's city walls, on June 15th. Asked by Richard for his demands once again, Tyler launched into a meandering vision of a mythical pre-Norman England where everyone was free and equal, when England was truly great. Tyler took a swig from a jug and spat it out in front of Richard, and that was his last rebellious act. Walworth, the London mayor, had concealed a knife in his clothing and fatally stabbed Tyler. Later that day, Tyler's head, now on a pike, was paraded around London for all the rebels to see. The peasants' hopes that King Richard would return England to an imaginary past was completely shattered. The rebellion was essentially over, and the dispirited peasants left London. Richard was victorious. What Tyler's revenge there was still Richard's retribution, which focused specifically on Essex and Kent counties and the villages where the rebellion started. Hundreds were slaughtered in revenge. For his heresies, John Ball was put on trial, found guilty, and then hanged, beheaded, and disemboweled. In the short term, what Tyler's utopian vision to end feudalism appeared a total failure. However, never again was there to be a general poll tax, and from that time forward, fearful manor lords granted more economic freedoms to the serfs. Serfdom withered away in England as market forces took hold, and lords realized it was more profitable to lease out their demesnes and pay workers to farm their lands. In the longer run, the peasants with their new freedom of mobility were able to leave the farms and find work in villages and cities, escaping agrarian life but facing new forms of economic feudalism. Our 21st century work landscape has certainly changed for the better, but we owe much to Tyler's vision of fair rules for workers, and his message of equality still echoes down the centuries and continues to drive our politics and reforms. Part 2. Taxes, fees, and unjust custom serfs paid more than taxes. They were stripped of dignity by evil customs. Lords claimed rights over inheritances, weddings, barns, mills, ovens, even pigs. A widow's dowry, gone, a peasant's old cart, claimed these were legal extortions. Mildews, forced oven use, corvée labour, abolition of feudalism in France. One of the central events of the French Revolution was the abolition of feudalism, and the old rules, taxes, and privileges left over from the Ancien regime. The National Constituent Assembly, after deliberating on the night of the 4th of August, 1789, announced, "The National Assembly abolishes the feudal system entirely." It abolished both the seigneurial rights of the Second Estate, the nobility, and the tithes gathered by the First Estate, the Catholic clergy. The old judicial system, founded on the 13 regional parliaments, was suspended in November 1789 and finally abolished in 1790. The fall of the Bastille on the 14th of July 1789 was followed by a mass uproar spreading from Paris to the countryside. Noble families were attacked, and many aristocratic manors were burned. Abbeys and castles were also attacked and destroyed. The season of La Grande Pere, the Great Fear, was characterized by social hysteria and anxiety over who was going to be the next victim. In many cases, the violence was begun not by homeless people or hunger-driven peasants, but by settled countrymen, who took this opportunity to further their own cause. The Great Fear opened up the vulnerability of the French government. There was a lack of authority at the very center of it. The prolonged riots and massacres led to a general anxiety that things might get out of control, and they did. It was an experience that the country had never undergone before. By late July 1789, as the peasant revolt reports poured into Paris from every part of the country, the National Constituent Assembly decided to reform the social pattern of the country in order to pacify the outraged peasants and encourage them towards peace and harmony. On the 4th of August, the Duke of Aiguillon proposed in the Club Breton the abolition of feudal rights and the suppression of personal servitude. On the evening of the 4th of August, the Viscount de Noailles proposed to abolish the privileges of the nobility to restore calm in French provinces. Members of the First Estate were at first reluctant to enter into the patriotic fervour of the night, but eventually Anne Louis, Henry de la Fère, Bishop of Nancy, and the Bishop of Chartres sacrificed their titles. Guy La Gouon d'Acre, the Viscount de Beauharnais, Jean-Baptiste Joseph de Lubessac, and de la Fère proposed to suppress the Banalites, seigneurial jurisdictions, game laws, and ecclesiastic privileges. The discussion continued through the night of the 4th of August, and on the morning of the 5th of August, the Assembly abolished the feudal system and eliminated many clerical and noble rights and privileges. The August decrees were 19 decrees made on the 4th to the 11th of August. There were 18 decrees or articles adopted concerning the abolition of feudalism, other privileges of the nobility, and seigneurial rights. Article 1. The Assembly declared the feudal system abolished thereafter, within the existing rights and dues, both feudal and censal. This refers to the SNZs, a perpetual due similar to the payments made by English copyholders. All those originating in or representing real or personal serfdom shall be abolished without indemnification. All other dues were redeemable, but the terms and mode of redemption was to be fixed by the Assembly. Those dues that were not removed by this decree were to be collected as usual until indemnification took place. Article 2. The exclusive right of feuilles, allowing birds to graze and dovecotes, is abolished. The pigeons will be locked up during times determined by the communities. During these periods, they will be considered prey, and anyone will be allowed to kill them on their properties. Article 3. The exclusive rights of keeping unenclosed warrens were abolished as well. Every landowner shall have the rights to destroy all kinds of game in their own land. However, public safety regulations must be maintained by them. All hunting spaces, including the royal forest, and all hunting rights were similarly abolished as well. There were provisions made for the king's hunting, however, for his personal pleasure in it. The President of the Assembly was commissioned to ask of the king the release of those people who were sent to prison or exiled for the violation of the previously existing hunting rights. Article 4. All the manorial courts were suppressed, but the judges and other officials of justice were allowed to continue with their duties until further instructions from the Assembly. Article 5. Any kind of tithes, as well as any substitution for them, were abolished. Whosoever possessed them, secular or regular congregations, by holders of benefices, members of corporations, including the Order of Malta and other religious and military orders, as well as those devoted to the maintenance of churches, those impropriated to laypersons, and those substituted for the portion congru. This expression refers to the minimum remuneration fixed for the priests, are abolished, on condition, however, that some other method be devised to provide for the expenses of divine worship, the support of the officiating clergy, for the assistance of the poor, for repairs and rebuilding of churches and parsonages, and for the maintenance of all institutions, seminaries, schools, academies, asylums, and organizations to which the present funds are devoted. Until these provisions were made, the assembly allowed the priests to collect the tithes. All the other tithes, which were not abolished under this law, were to be collected as usual. Article 6. All sorts of ground rents were redeemable at a price the assembly fixed. No dues were to be created in the future that were irredeemable. Article 7. The sale of judicial and municipal offices was abolished. Justice should be dispensed freely, however. All such magistrates were to do their duty until further instructions from the assembly. Article 8. As soon as the portion congru, further explanation needed was increased. The fees of all parish priests and curates were abolished. Article 9. Fiscal privileges in the payment of taxes were abolished forever. Taxes were to be collected from all the citizens in exactly the same manner, and plans were to be considered to set up a new method of tax collection. Article 10. All particular privileges given to certain provinces, districts, cities, cantons, and communes, financial or otherwise, were abolished because under the new rules, every part of France was equal. Article 11. All citizens, no matter what class or birth he might be, were eligible for any office in civil and military service. Article 12. No allowances were to be made for annates or for any other purpose to the court of Rome, the vice-legation at Avignon, or to the nunciature at Lucerne. The clergy should apply to their bishops for financial donations and benefits, which shall be given free to any church of France. Article 13. Various ecclesiastical dues were thereby abolished by the assembly. Article 14. The revenue limited to the clergies were restricted to the sum of 3,000 livres. Any individual could not enjoy the benefits of several pensions at the same time. If the pensions that he already enjoyed was more than 3,000 livres. Article 15. The king and the assembly would together consider all the reports that were to be presented with regards to pensions, favours, and salaries, and would have a right to suppress or reduce that which was undeserved. Article 16. A medal was to be struck in the memory of the important deliberations for the welfare of France, and a Te-Deum shall be chanted in gratitude in all the parishes and the churches of France. Article 17. King Louis XVI was proclaimed the restorer of French liberty. Article 18. The assembly was to present itself as a body before the king, and submit this important set of decrees, and Te-Deum was to be sung in the chapel of the king. Article 19. As soon as possible, the assembly was to give grave consideration to the drawing up of the laws that would help carry out these decrees. Without debate, the assembly enthusiastically adopted equality of taxation and redemption of all manorial rights, except for those involving personal servitude, which were to be abolished without indemnification. Other proposals followed with the same success. The equality of legal punishment, admission of all to public office, abolition of venality in office, the purchase of an office, conversion of the tithe into payments subject to redemption, freedom of worship, prohibition of plural holding of benefices, suppression of annats, the year's worth of income owed the Pope and the Bishop upon investiture, privileges of provinces and towns were offered as a last sacrifice in the course of a few hours. France abolished game laws, manorial courts, venal offices, especially judgeships, the purchase and sale of pecuniary immunities, favoritism in taxation of surplus money, first fruits, pluralities, clarification needed, and unmerited pensions. Towns, provinces, companies, and cities also sacrificed their special privileges. A medal was struck to commemorate the day, and the Assembly declared Louis XVI the restorer of French liberty. Francois Furet emphasizes that the decisions of August 1789 survived and became an integral part of the founding texts of modern France. They destroyed aristocratic society from top to bottom, along with its structure of dependencies and privileges. For this structure, they substituted the modern, autonomous individual, free to do whatever was not prohibited by law. The revolution thus distinguished itself quite early by its radical individualism. This Saint Bartholomew of abuses, as Francois Mignet calls it, has often been the subject of hyperbole in the analyses of contemporaries and historians. The atmosphere inside the assembly was so heady that confusion reigned in the provinces for months afterwards as to the true meaning of the laws. The real product of the night was not formalized until the Feudal Committee reported back on the 5th of March, 1790. The committee reintroduced the main morte explicitly outlawed by the original decrees, and set a rate of redemption for rights related to land that was impossible for the majority of peasants to pay, 30 times the annual rent. The Russian anarchist Prince Peter Kropotkin writes, "The assembly was carried away by its enthusiasm, and in this enthusiasm nobody remarked the clause for redeeming the feudal rights and tithes, which the two nobles and the two bishops had introduced into their speeches, a clause terrible even in its vagueness, since it might mean all or nothing, and did, in fact, postpone ... the abolition of feudal rights for 5 years, until August 1793. Kropotkin concludes, "The feudal rights remain," and scorns the other historians. The historic legend is lovingly used to embellish this night, and the majority of historians, copying the story as it has been given by a few contemporaries, represent it as a night full of enthusiasm and saintly abnegation. The August decrees were declared with the idea of calming the populace and encouraging them towards civility. However, the August decrees were revised numerous times over the next 2 years. King Louis XVI, in a letter, on the one hand expressed deep satisfaction with the noble and generous demarche of the first 2 orders of the state who, according to him, had made great sacrifices for the general reconciliation, for their patrie, and for their king. On the other hand, he went on to say that though the sacrifices were fine, I cannot admire it. I will never consent to the despoliation of my clergy and my nobility. I will never give my sanction to the decrees that despoil them, for then the French people one day could accuse me of injustice or weakness. What Louis was concerned with was not with the loss of position of the French nobility and clergy, but with adequate reparation for this loss. Meanwhile, the August decrees paved the way for the Assembly to make the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Origili. The peasants were supposed to pay for the release of seigneurial dues. These dues affected more than a quarter of the farmland in France and provided most of the income of the large landowners. The majority refused to pay, and in 1793 the obligation was cancelled. Thus, the peasants were awarded the land for free and also no longer paid the tithe to the CHURCHDMG. Sutherland has examined the results for peasants and landlords. The peasants no longer had to pay the tithe to the church. The landowners, however, were allowed to raise rents by the same amount as the former tithe. The national government then taxed away the income to owners by raising land taxes. Sutherland concludes that the peasants effectively paid twice in terms of higher rents and heavier taxes. Many tried to evade the burden in the long run. However, the burdens on the tenants and landlords were largely offset by major gains in productivity, which made everyone richer. Part 3. The shadow of rebellion oppression bred fury. Across Europe, peasants revolted, from the Jacquerie in France to England's Peasants' Revolt of 1381. They attacked manor houses, burned records, demanded freedom from corvée, labour and poll taxes, yet most revolts were brutally quelled, reinforcing lordly power until labour shortages forced change. Popular revolts in late medieval Europe. Popular revolts in late medieval Europe are historical uprisings and rebellions by peasants in the countryside, or the burgesses in towns, against nobles, abbots and kings during the upheavals between 1300 and 1500, part of a larger crisis of the late Middle Ages. Although sometimes known as peasant revolts, the phenomenon of popular uprisings was of broad scope and not just restricted to peasants. In Central Europe and the Balkan region, these rebellions expressed and helped cause a political and social disunity, paving the way for the expansion of the Ottoman Empire. Before the 14th century, popular uprisings, such as uprisings at a manor house against an unpleasant overlord, though not unknown, tended to operate on a local scale. This changed in the 14th and 15th centuries when new downward pressures on the poor resulted in mass movements of popular uprisings across Europe. For example, Germany between 1336 and 1525 witnessed no fewer than 60 instances of militant peasant unrest. Most of the revolts expressed the desire of those below to share in the wealth, status, and well-being of those more fortunate. In the end, they were almost always defeated by the nobles. A new attitude emerged in Europe, that peasant was a pejorative concept. It was something separate and seen in a negative light from those who had wealth and status. This was an entirely new social stratification from earlier times when society had been based on the three orders: those who work, those who pray, and those who fight, when being a peasant meant being next to God. Just like the other orders, the main reasons cited for these mass uprisings are an increasing gap between the wealthy and poor, declining incomes of the poor, rising inflation, taxation, the external crises of famine, plague, war, and religious conflict. The social gap between rich and poor had become more extreme. The origins of this change can be traced to the 12th century and the rise of the concept of nobility. Dress, behavior, courtesy, speech, diet, education, all became part of the noble class, making them distinct from others. By the 14th century, the nobles had indeed become very different in their behavior, appearance, and values from those beneath. The nobles, however, also faced a crisis of declining income. By 1285, inflation had become rampant, in part due to population pressures, and some nobles charged rent based on customary fixed rates, based on the feudal system. So, as the price of goods and services rose from inflation, the income of those nobles remained stagnant, effectively dropping. To make matters worse, the nobles had become accustomed to a more luxurious lifestyle that required more money. To address this, nobles illegally raised rents, cheated, stole, and sometimes resorted to outright violence to maintain this lifestyle. Kings who needed money to finance wars resorted to devaluing currency by cutting silver and gold coins with less precious metal, which resulted in increased inflation and, in the end, increased tax rates. The 14th century crises of famine, plague, and war put additional pressures on those at the bottom. The plague, in particular, drastically reduced the numbers of people who were workers and producing the wealth. Finally, layered on top of this was a popular ideological view of the time that property, wealth, and inequality were against the teachings of God, as expressed through the teachings of the Franciscans. The sentiment of the time was probably best expressed by preacher John Ball during the English Peasant Revolt, when he said, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" criticizing economic inequality as human-made rather than a creation of God. Different historians who will use different terms to describe these events. The word peasant, since the 14th century, has had a pejorative meaning. However, it was not always that way. Peasants were once viewed as pious and seen with respect and pride. As nobles increasingly lived better quality lives, there arose a new consciousness of those on top and those below, and the sense that being a peasant was not a position of equality. This new consciousness coincided with the popular uprisings of the 14th century. Research by Rodney Hilton in the 1970s showed that the Peasants' Revolt, or Great Rising, was led not by peasants, but by those who would be the most affected by increased taxation. The merchants, who were not wealthy, but not poor either. Indeed, these revolts were often accompanied by landless knights, excommunicated clerics, and other members of society who might find gain or have reason to rebel. Although these were popular revolts, they were often organized and led by people who would not have considered themselves peasants. Peasants is typically a term used to denote the rural agrarian poor, while many uprisings involved tradesmen and occurred within towns and cities. Thus, the term does not fully encompass events as a whole for the period. For historical writing purposes, many modern historians will use the word peasant with care and respect, choosing other phrases such as popular or from below or grassroots. Although in some countries in Central and Eastern Europe, where serfdom continued up to the 19th century in places, the word peasant is still used by some historians as the main description of these events. Historiography of medieval peasants, from a nameless mass to a thriving CIO, MU90 conception of medieval peasants in popular consciousness has been often anonymous mass of people pinched by hunger and oppressed by the aristocracy for whom it labored. In the occasional mention of them in scholarship, illiterate peasants existed in rags, slaving for the lord of the land Tokich. They were bound. Popular, if satirical, depictions such as Monty Python and The Holy Grail reflect that idea. Scholarly depictions of medieval manorial peasants did little to relieve that conception or allocate to them a measure of academic attention until the mid-20th century. The 20th century was a period of transition in general historiography, according to Georg G. Igor. Traditional historiography of the 18th and 19th centuries was concerned with the elites of politics and society, while the new forms of social science-oriented history emphasized social structures and processes of social change, one taking a bottom-up approach and including former marginalized groups. The 20th century ushered in a movement of inclusion of fringe social groups. Until the mid-20th century, medieval historians focused their energies on surveys of the Middle Ages, dealing specifically with foreign invasions, development of the papacy, and the creation of feudalism. The study of manorialism, especially the personality of the plebeian whom the manorial system rested, was virtually absent. Scholarship of the 30s and 40s broadened in scope and included explications of the manorial system as well as studies of race, class, and gender. Scholars such as Mark Bloch delved into the intricacies of the manorial system as distinguished from feudalism and built upon the facts provided by earlier scholars, such as H.W.C. Davis and Carl Stevenson. Scholars became more interested in social histories and the people behind the classes and generalizations. The closely intertwined feudal and manorial systems served as the political and economic foundations of the medieval period. The feudal system was dependent upon the manorial system, though the lifespan of the manorial system exceeded that of the feudal system. The feudal system was a product of the 9th and 10th centuries, especially the disturbance of the invasions of Vikings from north, Magyars from the east, and the Saracens from the south. The manorial system both preceded and succeeded feudalism. Manorialism was an arrangement which was much older than vassalage, and which was for a long time to survive. It, too, although the concept of a weaker man seeking the historiography of medieval peasants' economic protection of a stronger man, a concept foundational in both systems, was not a new concept in the medieval period. The turmoil of invasion and social structures reinforced the idea and brought it to prominence, a method of both economic and physical security, according to Mark Bloch. After the fall of the Roman Empire in the mid-5th century and in the Merovingian society of the 6th century, neither the state nor the family any longer provided adequate protection. Everywhere, the weak man felt the need to be sheltered by someone more powerful. 3. The systems were symbiotic because they functioned simultaneously and because, at a basic level, they resembled each other. Both systems involved the transference of authority over a man from himself to a more powerful man. The use of land as a type of currency with which men transferred authority, the exaction of a certain type of homage or due, and a developed hierarchy resulting from the transference of authority. A crucial difference between the two social structures was the purpose of their existence. Feudalism was a political and social organization, while manorialism existed for economic purposes. Feudalism concerned the aristocracy and gentry, while manorialism concerned the peasantry, a mass of people who functioned around their respective manor houses, rather than as a complete social unit. For the Middle Ages, adopted pre-existing, though rudimentary, hierarchical organization and vassalage traditions and polished them, creating a more extensive network of contracts and subcontracts between lords, tenants-in-chief, and subtenants, according to H.W.C. Davis. The system of vassalage and patronage existed cross-culturally and cross-temporally in traditions such as Thecamatatis of the Germanic warlords and the intrusions of the Merovingian kings. These bands functioned as the military force and the protection of Thurling chieftain. In the 8th and 9th centuries, particularly under theologians, monarchs began systematically granting these bands of men land to reward them and to further bind them to the monarch's service, in exchange for land first called beneficium, reflecting classical tradition, and renamed fiefs during the 9th century and protection. The vassi rendered military service and upheld the honor of their leader, Bot 5, although the vassals were already participants in the primitive warband in early feudalism. In the 10th and 11th centuries, the men outside the feudal system began voluntarily sabbing their services and swearing an oath of fealty to a lord in exchange for land and protection. This was the crux of the feudal organization, for it is on obtaining specialized service, essentially military, by granting support in land known as fee or fief, that the characterization of feudalism and feudal society's fiefs also arose through the transference of allodial lands or freehold tenures, which the proprietor held absolutely to a more powerful lord. The lord then released that land back to the very same man as a tenure or fief, there was an advantage for both the powerful and the weak in joining forces, and often the same man was both lord over one and vassal to another, with the exception of the English feudal system, which fueled the complex web of feudal relationships. Philip Myers wrote, "Each vassal became a virtual sovereign in his own domain, and the monarch or lord had a pre-existing force of military men whenever he needed it, as well as court retainers, because his vassals regularly owed suit to the lord's court." 7. There is a difficulty inherent in an exploration of the manorial system because the reality of the system varied from region to region. For example, manorialism was a more recent development on the British Isles than in the Frankish kingdom, so the customs and regulations governing each varied. According to Philip Myers, the serf's status varied greatly from country to country and from period to period. Consequently, it is impossible to give any general account of the class, which can be regarded as a true picture of their actual condition as a body at any given time. 8. There are, however, basic structures of manorialism that existed in some combination throughout the medieval period and across Europe, facilitating a discussion of the system. Manors or great estates, subdivided amongst free tenants or servi, who were bound to the land, existed in the classical period as expansive Latifundie.9. A significant characteristic of medieval manorialism was the control of the estapi, the very vassals participating in the feudal system. The estates were either theland that the lord had granted to the vassal upon the ceremonial oath of fealty, or land that was formerly an allodial landholding. In turn, some of the subtenants of the manorial lord had once been freeholders of allodial land. A manor was an economic enterprise, and first and foremost an estate, a part of a system which flourished on all sides, because under it the mass of the people found the possibility of livelihood. 10. It had three basic components: the lord's domain, which the free and unfree tenants farmed; the 30-acre plots of the tenant farmers, which occasionally coincided with a village; and the strips of land farmed by the serfs bound to the land. The basic distinction in manorial tenants was free versus unfree. However, within those basic distinctions there were gradations of servitude, and the titles of those categories varied from century to century and from region to region. For example, in Britain, the term villains, historiography of medieval peasants existed throughout the medieval period. Initially, in the Domesday Book, it delineated free tenants, but by the 13th century, the villain slipped down into the category of the unfree. 11. The Codex Justinianus, a tripartite law coda compiled by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, used the term coloniate to delineate peasants bound to the land. He shall be attached to the lord of the land so that he may not be able to depart without suffering penalties, the law code says, adding that coloni are not to leave those places, the fruits of which support them. 12. Serfs was a fairly consistent term used on the continent to delineate the unfree peasants. Often, the free tenants formerly had allodial land, which they submitted to the manorial lord, who rented their same land back to them as a tenement. The free tenants typically farmed about 27 acres, farming their own plot for their sustenance, as well as the lord's domain for manorial income. The serfs were bound to the land and farmed small strips of land, averaging 18 acres, while the free tenants were able to reserve until some of their excess produce. The serfs farmed for the lord alone and received no wages, a situation binding them to the land. The Domesday Book preserved extensive records of manorial divisions, as well as the land tenantadand worked by specific people. Although the farming of the manorial estate was a communal endeavour, the inhabitants knew their specific plot, and so did Thasted and Reeve, who would have collected rent from the peasants. A record of Hetcham village in the Domesday Book, recorded in 1086, shortly after the Norman conquest of England, says Peter de Valence holds in domain Hetcham, which Haldane a freeman held in the time of King Edward, as a manor, and as 5 hides. There have always been 2 ploughs in the domain, 4 ploughs of the men. This demonstrates the detailed records that helped make manorialism a widespread and successful system. 13. Virtually every peasant was also obbligato perform service, or corvée, which could manifest in anything from labouring floors, land certain days in the year, to repairing infrastructure such as roads and buildings on the manorial estate. Occasionally, a village consisted of theproperty of just one manor, but the actualities of the system were far from clear-cut and systematic. The tenants of each lord existed in a sort of community in which they often worked together in a communal system and shared plowonimals of Marx, namely his Communist Manifesto, published in 1845. Marx depicted peasants, though not specifically medieval peasants, as a class oppressed under the heel of the upper classes through taxes and, more importantly, through labour, industrial and agricultural. Marx devoted his writings to economics, class struggle and politics. The term political economy appears throughout his work, denoting the kinship between economy and politics. He decried the class system, saying, "An oppressed class is the vital condition for every society founded on the antagonism of classes," according to Marx. It is under the dominance of the property owners that the worker property-less sinks to the level of a commodity and becomes indeed the most wretched of commodities. Marx predicted that society was on a straight track to political revolution. Acclimax he called a brutal contradiction, the shock of body against body. Marxist theory was popular throughout the 19th century, leading to the conception of peasants as a ragged, ignorant, and potentially violent class, and still had bearings on the 20th century, though some scholars began to challenge his theories. 16. Philip van Ness Myers published The Middle Ages in 1885, representing the initial move towards social history. He intended that his sketch may not be a recital simply of outer circumstances, but a history of the real inner life of European people. Myers praised the medieval period as crucial to both the existence of the Italian Renaissance and the modern period. He wrote, "Over all regions covered by the barbarian inundation, a new stratum of population was thrown down. A new soil formed that was capable of nourishing a better civilization than any the world had yet seen." Myers intended his history to be a social one, so he first examined the 3 influences conjoining in the Middle Ages: Teutonic, classical, Christian, and then looked at specific cultural traits of each that had a hand in medieval culture, such as the Teutons' veneration of womanhood and love of personal freedom. 17. Despite Myers's good intentions, he included only 2 brief pages on the manorial system, which he treated as a subset of feudalism. He covered the predominant medieval topics and delved into the development of towns. However, manorialism receives little attention. He recognized that the vassals, or fiefholders, of various grades constituted only a very small portion, perhaps 5% or less, of the population of the countries where feudalism came to prevail. Yet, that admission did not induce him to dedicate any more time to the participants in the manorial system. His short depiction of the serfs is not a pleasant one. The poor serf existed under a heavy yoke of servitude, and his share was only just sufficient to keep the wolf of hunger from his door. The cursory glance given towards the peasants does not provide sufficient context. Part 4. Life in the fields, eternal toil. Daily life for peasants was grueling. Sunrise to sunset, with simple tools, plows, sickles, oxen. Meals were thin porridge and rye bread. There was no rest, crop disease, winter cold, and no medicine. Most died under 40. Even small acts of rest felt like defiance. Medieval German feudal society, castles on hills, armored knights on horseback, and peasants toiling in the fields. This is the familiar image of medieval life. But behind these visuals was a powerful and deeply structured system that defined medieval Germany. Feudalism, feudal society in medieval Germany wasn't just about who owned land. It was about relationships between kings and nobles, lords and vassals, peasants and the church. It was a society built on loyalty, obligation, and hierarchy. Understanding how this system worked helps us see how medieval Germans lived, worked, fought, and worshipped, how power was shared and controlled. What is feudalism at its core? Feudalism was a system of land-based relationships that structured medieval society. The king or emperor owned all the land in theory. He granted portions of it to powerful nobles, lords, in exchange for loyalty and military service. These lords could then grant land to vassals, often knights, who served them in return. At the bottom were the peasants and serfs, who worked the land in exchange for protection. In Germany, this system developed under the Ottonian and Salian dynasties and became increasingly formalized in the High Middle Ages, c. 1000 to 1300, closing parenthesis, the feudal hierarchy in medieval Germany. Let's break down the main social classes. 1. The king or emperor. In theory, the Holy Roman Emperor stood at the top, but in reality, his control varied by region. He depended on powerful dukes, bishops, and electors to enforce imperial authority. 2. Nobles and Decusha-ranking nobles held large territories and significant power. In Germany, key duchies like Saxony, Bavaria, and Swabia were semi-independent. These nobles collected taxes and rents, administered justice, raised armies for the emperor or against him. 3. Knights and vassals. Lesser nobles served as vassals to lords. In return for a fief land grant, they pledged military service, counsel, and loyalty. Many were knights, professional warriors who trained from boyhood. Knighthood wasn't just about combat. It also came with a code of chivalry, including loyalty, honor, and protection of the weak. 4. Peasants and serfs. At the base of the pyramid were the peasants. They made up over 90% of the population and did most of the farming. Free peasants could own or rent land. Serfs were bound to the land and could not leave without permission. They paid rents in crops or labor and were expected to serve their lord, but in return, they received protection from raiders and famine. The role of the church, the Catholic Church, was a major landowner and power broker in medieval Germany. Monasteries, abbeys, and bishoprics held enormous tracts of land. Bishops and abbots often acted like feudal lords. The emperor appointed bishops, in many cases, until the investiture controversy. Church tithes, 10% of a peasant's income or harvest, supported religious institutions. Priests and monks provided not only spiritual guidance, but also education, record-keeping, and healthcare. Daily life in feudal Germany. Life was hard, but not always bleak. The rhythm of daily life was tied to the seasons, the church calendar, and the local lord's needs. Peasants planted, harvested, and tended livestock. Most never traveled more than a few miles from their homes. Lords and ladies managed estates, hosted feasts, and settled disputes. Knights trained in martial skills and participated in tournaments and warfare. Holidays, religious festivals, and markets provided community and celebration. Local churches were the centers of spiritual and social life. Castles and manors. The castle was more than a military fortress. It was the administrative heart of a lord's domain. Housed the noble family and their retainers, stored supplies, and arms served as a refuge during attacks. The surrounding manor included villages, farmland, mills, and sometimes forests. It was the basic unit of feudal economy. Rights and obligations. Feudal relationships were built on mutual obligations. Lords owed protection and justice. Vassals owed service and loyalty. Peasants owed labor and rent. These weren't casual arrangements. They were formalized through oaths of fealty and ceremonies, often held on sacred relics or altars. The complexity of German feudalism. German feudalism was especially complex. Multiple layers of vassalage meant some lords were both vassals and overlords. Loyalties were personal, not institutional, certain. Feuds and rivalries were common. Emperors had to negotiate with dozens of independent princes, bishops, and city-states. This web of relationships made central control difficult, but also kept the empire resilient and flexible. Long-term effects. Feudalism shaped German life for centuries. It fostered regional diversity and local identity. It slowed the development of a strong, centralized state compared to France. It entrenched social hierarchies, but also preserved rural communities and traditions. Many of Germany's medieval castles, market towns, and family names trace their origins to the feudal period. Medieval German feudal society was built on loyalty, land, and layered obligations. It created a decentralized but enduring framework for life, law, and leadership. From the fields of the Rhine to the towers of Bavaria, the echoes of this system still shape the cultural landscape of Germany today. The Middle Ages in German history, an overview of the political, cultural, and religious transformations that shaped Germany from the fall of the Carolingian Empire to the dawn of the Reformation, including the rise of the Holy Roman Empire and medieval society. Otto I and the birth of the Holy Roman Empire explore how Otto I's coronation in 962 marked the formal beginning of the Holy Roman Empire, establishing a powerful political and religious legacy in medieval Germany. The Hanseatic League. Discover the rise of this powerful trade alliance of northern German cities that dominated commerce across the Baltic and North Seas during the late Middle Ages. German castles and knightly culture. Dive into the architectural and chivalric world of medieval Germany, where fortified castles and knightly ideals shaped warfare, literature, and noble identity. The investiture controversy, a pivotal power struggle between church and state. This conflict reshaped the relationship between emperors and popes across the German medieval landscape. The Black Death in Germany trace the devastating impact of the 14th century plague on German towns and villages, altering demographics, labor systems, and religious life. Peasant revolts in the Middle Ages. Examine the causes and consequences of peasant uprisings in medieval Germany, including their role in challenging feudal oppression and economic hardship. The Teutonic Knights and Eastern expansion follow. The military and missionary campaigns of the Teutonic Order as they expanded Germanic influence eastward into pagan territories. German medieval universities explore the intellectual revival of the High Middle Ages as cathedral schools and universities flourished in German cities, preserving classical knowledge and fostering new ideas. the Golden Bull of 1356, understand the constitutional landmark that formalized the election of German kings, shaping imperial governance in the Holy Roman Empire for centuries. Part 5. Chains begin to crack. Social change, then plague struck. Labor shortages empowered serfs, they demanded wages. But nobles fought back. The 1351 Statute of Laborers froze pay and forbade mobility. Yet, for the first time, peasants could flee, negotiate, or escape into towns. The era of bondage began to fade. Peasants' Revolt. The Peasants' Revolt, also named Wat Tyler's Rebellion, or the Great Rising, was a major uprising across large parts of England in 1381. The revolt had various causes, including the socio-economic and political tensions generated by the Black Death in the 1340s, the high taxes resulting from the conflict with France during the 100 Years' War, and instability within the local leadership of London. The revolt heavily influenced the course of the 100 Years' War by deterring later parliaments from raising additional taxes to pay for military campaigns in France. Interpretations of the revolt by academics have shifted over the years. It was once seen as a defining moment in English history, in particular causing a promise by King Richard II to abolish serfdom, and a suspicion of lollardy. But modern academics are less certain of its impact on subsequent social and economic history. The revolt has been widely used in socialist literature, including by the author William Morris, and remains a potent symbol for the political left, informing the arguments surrounding the introduction of the community charge in the United Kingdom during the 1980s. Terminology: the term Peasants' Revolt does not occur in medieval sources. Contemporary chronicles did not give the events a specific title, and the term peasant did not appear in the English language until the 15th century. In the 18th and 19th centuries, it was generally known as the insurrection of Wat Tyler, though he commented that which 18th or 19th century historian first used the doubly discredited phrase, Peasants' Revolt, I have been unable to determine. Paul Strome's first identified usage of the term was in John Richard Green's Short History of the English People in 1874. The name has been critiqued by modern historians such as Strome and Miri Rubin, both on the grounds that many in the movements were not peasants, and that the events more closely resemble a prolonged protest or rising rather than a revolt or rebellion. Alternative terms include the 1381 Rising and the English Rising of 1381. Economics main article: Consequences of the Black Death. The Peasants' Revolt was fed by the economic and social upheaval of the 14th century. At the start of the century, the majority of English people worked in the countryside economy that fed the countries, towns, and cities, and supported an extensive international trade. Across much of England, production was organized around manors, controlled by local lords, including the gentry and the church, and governed through a system of manorial courts. Some of the population were unfree serfs, who had to work on their lord's lands for a period each year. Although the balance of free and unfree varied across England, and in the southeast serfdom was relatively rare. Some serfs were born unfree and could not leave their manors to work elsewhere without the consent of the local lord. Others accepted limitations on their freedom. As part of the tenure agreement for their farmland, population growth led to pressure on the available agricultural land, increasing the power of local landowners. In 1348, a plague, known as the Black Death, crossed from mainland Europe into England, rapidly killing an estimated 50% of the population. After an initial period of economic shock, England began to adapt to the changed economic situation. The death rate among the peasantry meant that suddenly land was relatively plentiful and laborers in much shorter supply. Laborers could charge more for their work, and, in the consequent competition for labor, wages were driven sharply upwards. In turn, the profits of landowners were eroded. The trading, commercial and financial networks in the towns disintegrated. The authorities responded to the chaos by passing emergency legislation, the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, and the Statute of Labourers in 1351. These attempted to fix wages at pre-plague levels, making it a crime to refuse work or to break an existing contract, imposing fines on those who transgressed. The system was initially enforced through special justices of labourers and then, from the 1360s onwards, through the normal justices of the peace, typically members of the local gentry. Although in theory these laws applied to both labourers seeking higher wages and to employers tempted to outbid their competitors for workers, they were in practice applied only to labourers. And then, in a rather arbitrary fashion, the legislation was strengthened in 1361, with the penalties increased to include branding and imprisonment. The royal government had not intervened in this way before, nor allied itself with the local landowners in quite such an obvious or unpopular way. Over the next few decades, economic opportunities increased for the English peasantry. Some labourers took up specialist jobs that would have previously been barred to them, and others moved from employer to employer or became servants in richer households. These changes were keenly felt across the southeast of England, where the London market created a wide range of opportunities for farmers and artisans. Local lords had the right to prevent serfs from leaving their manors, but when serfs found themselves blocked in the manorial courts, many simply left to work illegally on manors elsewhere. Wages continued to rise, and between the 1340s and the 1380s, the purchasing power of rural labourers increased by around 40%. As the wealth of the lower classes increased, Parliament brought in fresh laws in 1363 to prevent them from consuming expensive goods, formerly only affordable by the elite. These sumptuary laws proved unenforceable, but the wider labour laws continued to be firmly applied. War and finance. Another factor in the revolt of 1381 was the conduct of the war with France. In 1337, Edward III of England had pressed his claims to the French throne, beginning a long-running conflict that became known as the 100 Years' War. Edward had initial successes, but his campaigns were not decisive. Charles V of France became more active in the conflict after 1369, taking advantage of his country's greater economic strength to commence cross-channel raids on England. By the 1370s, England's armies on the continent were under huge military and financial pressure. The garrisons in Calais and Brest alone, for example, were costing £36,000 a year to maintain, while military expeditions could consume £50,000. In only 6 months, NB1 Edward died in 1377, leaving the throne to his grandson, Richard II, then only 10 years old. Richard's government was formed around his uncles, most prominently the rich and powerful John of Gaunt, and many of his grandfather's former senior officials. They faced the challenge of financially sustaining the war. In France, taxes in the 14th century were raised on an ad hoc basis through Parliament, then comprising the lords, the titled aristocracy and clergy, and the commons, the representatives of the knights, merchants, and senior gentry from across England. These taxes were typically imposed on a household's movable possessions, such as their goods or stock. The raising of these taxes affected the members of the commons much more than the lords. To complicate matters, The official statistics used to administer the taxes predated the Black Death, and, since the size and wealth of local communities had changed greatly since the plague, effective collection had become increasingly difficult. Just before Edward's death, Parliament introduced a new form of taxation called the poll tax, which was levied at the rate of 4p on every person over the age of 14, with a deduction for married couples. NB2, designed to spread the cost of the war over a broader economic base than previous tax levies. This round of taxation proved extremely unpopular but raised £22,000. The war continued to go badly, and, despite raising some money through forced loans, the Crown returned to Parliament in 1379 to request further funds. The Commons were supportive of the young king, but had concerns about the amounts of money being sought and the way this was being spent by the king's councillors, whom they suspected of corruption. A second poll tax was approved, this time with a sliding scale of taxes against 7 different classes of English society, with the upper classes paying more in absolute terms. Widespread evasion proved to be a problem, and the tax only raised £18,600, far short of the £50,000 that had been hoped for. In November 1380, Parliament was called together again in Northampton. Archbishop Simon Sudbury, the new Lord Chancellor, updated the Commons on the worsening situation in France, a collapse in international trade, and the risk of the Crown having to default on its debts. The Commons were told that the colossal sum of £160,000 was now required in new taxes, and arguments ensued between the Royal Council and Parliament about what to do next. Parliament passed a third poll tax, this time on a flat rate basis of 12p on each person over 15, with no allowance made for married couples, which they estimated would raise £66,666. The third poll tax was highly unpopular, and many in the southeast evaded it by refusing to register. The Royal Council appointed new commissioners in March 1381 to interrogate local village and town officials in an attempt to find those who were refusing to comply. The extraordinary powers and interference of these teams of investigators in local communities, prima praetist and authorities, decades running up to 1381, were a rebellious, troubled period. London was a particular focus of unrest, and the activities of the city's politically active guilds and fraternities often alarmed the authorities. Londoners resented the expansion of the royal legal system in the capital, in particular the increased role of the Marshalsea Court in Southwark, which had begun to compete with the city authorities for judicial power in London. NB3. The city's population also resented the presence of foreigners, Flemish weavers in particular. Londoners detested John of Gaunt, because he was a supporter of the religious reformer John Wycliffe, whom the London public regarded as a heretic. John of Gaunt was also engaged in a feud with the London elite and was rumoured to be planning to replace the elected mayor with a captain appointed by the Crown. The London elite were themselves fighting out a vicious internal battle for political power. As a result, in 1381, the ruling classes in London were unstable and divided. Rural communities, particularly in the southeast, were unhappy with the operation of serfdom and the use of the local manorial courts to exact traditional fines and levies, not least because the same landowners who ran these courts also often acted as enforcers of the unpopular labour laws or as royal judges. Many of the village elites refused to take up positions in local government and began to frustrate the operation of the courts. Animals seized by the courts began to be retaken by their owners, and legal officials were assaulted. Some started to advocate the creation of independent village communities, respecting traditional laws but separate from the hated legal system centered in London. As the historian Miri Rubin describes, for many, the problem was not the country's laws, but those charged with applying and safeguarding them. Concerns were raised about these changes in society. William Langland wrote the poem Piers Plowman in the years before 1380, praising peasants who respected the law and worked hard for their lords, but complaining about greedy, travelling labourers demanding higher wages. The poet John Gower warned against a future revolt in both Myru, Dalam, and Vox Clamantis. There was a moral panic about the threat posed by newly arrived workers in the towns and the possibility that servants might turn against their masters. New legislation was introduced in 1359 to deal with migrants. Existing conspiracy laws were more widely applied, and the treason laws were extended to include servants or wives who betrayed their masters and husbands. By the 1370s, there were fears that if the French invaded England, the rural classes might side with the invaders. The discontent began to give way to open protest. In 1377, the Great Rumour occurred in southeast and southwest England. Rural workers organized themselves and refused to work for their lords, arguing that, according to the Domesday Book, they were exempted from such requests. The workers made unsuccessful appeals to the law courts and the king. There were also widespread urban tensions, particularly in London, where John of Gaunt narrowly escaped being lynched. The troubles increased again in 1380, with protests and disturbances across northern England and in the western towns of Shrewsbury and Bridgewater. An uprising occurred in York, during which John de Gisborne, the city's mayor, was removed from office, and fresh tax riots followed. In early 1381, there was a great storm in England during May 1381, which many felt to prophesy future change and upheaval, adding further to the disturbed mood. The final trigger for the revolt was the intervention of a royal official, John Bampton, in Essex on the 30th of May 1381. His attempts to collect unpaid poll taxes in Brentwood ended in a violent confrontation, which rapidly spread across the southeast of the country. A wide spectrum of rural society, including many local artisans and village officials, rose up in protest, burning court records and opening the local prisons. The rebels sought a reduction in taxation, an end to serfdom, and the removal of King Richard II's senior officials and law courts. Inspired by the sermons of the radical cleric John Ball and led by Wat Tyler, a contingent of Kentish rebels advanced on London. They were met at Blackheath by representatives of the royal government, who unsuccessfully attempted to persuade them to return home. King Richard, then aged 14, retreated to the safety of the Tower of London, but most of the royal forces were abroad or in northern England. On the 13th of June, the rebels entered London and, joined by many local townsfolk, attacked the prisons, destroyed the Savoy Palace, set fire to law books and buildings in the Temple, and killed anyone associated with the royal government. The following day, Richard met the rebels at Mile End and agreed to most of their demands, including the abolition of serfdom. Meanwhile, rebels entered the Tower of London, killing Simon Sudbury, Lord Chancellor, and Robert Hales, Lord High Treasurer, whom they found inside. On the 15th of June, Richard left the city to meet Tyler and the rebels at Smithfield. Violence broke out, and Richard's party killed Tyler. Richard diffused the tense situation long enough for London's mayor, William Walworth, to gather a militia from the city and disperse the rebel forces. Richard immediately began to re-establish order in London and rescinded his previous grants to the rebels. The revolt had also spread into East Anglia, where the University of Cambridge was attacked and many royal officials were killed. Unrest continued until the intervention of Henry Despenser, who defeated a rebel army at the Battle of North Walsham on the 25th or the 26th of June. Troubles extended north to York, Beverley, and Scarborough, and as far west as Bridgewater in Somerset. Richard mobilized 4,000 soldiers to restore order. Most of the rebel leaders were tracked down and executed. By November, at least 1,500 rebels had been killed. Outbreak of Revoltessex and Kenther Revolt of 1381 broke out in Essex, following the arrival of John Bampton to investigate non-payment of the poll tax. On the 30th of May, Bampton was a member of Parliament, a justice of the peace, and well connected with royal circles. He based himself in Brentwood and summoned representatives from the neighbouring villages of Corringham, Fobbing and Stamford le Hope to explain and make good the shortfalls. On the 1st of June, the villagers appear to have arrived well organised and armed with old bows and sticks. Bampton first interrogated the people of Fobbing, whose representative, Thomas Baker, declared that his village had already paid their taxes and that no more money would be forthcoming. When Bampton and 2 sergeants attempted to arrest Baker, violence broke out. Bampton escaped and retreated to London, but 3 of his clerks and several of the Brentwood townsfolk who had agreed to act as jurors were killed. Robert Belknap, the Chief Justice of the Court of Common Pleas, who was probably already holding court in the area, was empowered to arrest and deal with the perpetrators by the next day. The revolt was rapidly growing. The villagers spread the news across the region, and John Jeffrey, a local bailiff, rode between Brentwood and Chelmsford, rallying support. On the 4th of June, the rebels gathered at Bocking, where their future plans seem to have been discussed. The Essex rebels, possibly a few thousand strong, advanced towards London, some probably travelling directly and others via Kent. One group, under the leadership of John Raw, a former chaplain, marched north towards the neighbouring county of Suffolk, with the intention of raising a revolt there. Revolt also flared in neighbouring Kent. Sir Simon de Burley, a close associate of both Edward III and the young Richard, had claimed that a man in Kent, called Robert Belling, was an escaped serf from one of his estates. Burley sent 2 sergeants to Gravesend, where Belling was living, to reclaim him. Gravesend's local bailiffs and Belling tried to negotiate a solution under which Burley would accept a sum of money in return for dropping his case. But this failed, and Belling was taken away to be imprisoned at Rochester Castle. A furious group of local people gathered at Dartford, possibly on the 5th of June, to discuss the matter. From there, the rebels travelled to Maidstone, where they stormed the prison, and then on to Rochester on the 6th of June. Faced by the angry crowds, the constable in charge of Rochester Castle surrendered it without a fight, and Belling was freed. Some of the Kentish crowds now dispersed, but others continued. From this point, they appear to have been led by Wat Tyler, whom the Chronicle suggests was elected their leader at a large gathering at Maidstone on the 7th of June. Relatively little is known about Tyler's former life. Chroniclers suggest that he was from Essex, had served in France as an archer, and was a charismatic and capable leader. Several chroniclers believe that he was responsible for shaping the political aims of the revolt. Some also mention a Jack Straw as a leader among the Kentish rebels during this phase in the revolt, but it is uncertain if this was a real person, or a pseudonym for Wat Tyler or John Raw. NB for Tyler and the Kentish men advanced to Canterbury, entering the walled city and castle without resistance on the 10th of June. The rebels deposed the absent Archbishop of Canterbury, Sudbury, and made the cathedral monks swear loyalty to their cause. They attacked properties in the city with links to the hated royal council, and searched the city for suspected enemies, dragging the suspects out of their houses and executing them. The city prison was opened and the prisoners freed. Tyler then persuaded a few thousand of the rebels to leave Canterbury and advance with him on London the next morning. March on the capital. The Kentish advance on London appears to have been coordinated with the movement of the rebels in Essex, Suffolk and Norfolk. Their forces were armed with weapons including sticks, battle axes, old swords and bows. NB5 along their way. They encountered Lady Joan, the king's mother, who was travelling back to the capital to avoid being caught up in the revolt. She was mocked, but otherwise left unharmed. The Kentish rebels reached Blackheath, just southeast of the capital. On the 12th of June, NB6 word of the revolt reached the king at Windsor Castle on the night of the 10th of June. He travelled by boat down the River Thames to London the next day, taking up residence in the powerful fortress of the Tower of London for safety, where he was joined by his mother, Archbishop Sudbury, the Lord High Treasurer Sir Robert Hales, the Earls of Arundel, Salisbury and Warwick, and several other senior nobles. A delegation, headed by Thomas Brinton, the Bishop of Rochester, was sent out from London to negotiate with the rebels and persuade them to return home. At Blackheath, John Ball gave a famous sermon to the assembled Kentishmen. 100 Ball was a well-known priest and radical preacher from Kent, who was by now closely associated with Tyler. 101 chroniclers' accounts vary as to how he came to be involved in the revolt. He may have been released from Maidstone prison by the crowds, or might have been already at liberty when the revolt broke out. 102. Ball rhetorically asked the crowds when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then a gentleman, and promoted the rebel slogan with King Richard and the true commons of England. 100. The phrases emphasized the rebel opposition to the continuation of serfdom and peat to the hierarchies of the church and state that separated the subject from the king, while stressing that they were loyal to the monarchy and, unlike the king's advisers, were true to Richard. 103. The rebels rejected proposals from the Bishop of Rochester that they should return home, and instead prepared to march on. Discussions took place in the Tower of London about how to deal with the revolt. The king had only a few troops at hand, in the form of the castle's garrison, his immediate bodyguard, and, at most, several hundred soldiers. 104 NB7. Many of the more experienced military commanders were in France, Ireland and Germany, and the nearest major military force was in the north of England, guarding against a potential Scottish invasion. 106 Resistance in the provinces was also complicated by English law, which stated that only the king could summon local militias or lawfully execute rebels and criminals, leaving many local lords unwilling to attempt to suppress the uprisings on their own authority. 107. Since the Blackheath negotiations had failed, the decision was taken that the king himself should meet the rebels at Greenwich, on the south side of the Thames. 108. Guarded by 4 barges of soldiers, Richard sailed from the Tower on the morning of the 13th of June, where he was met on the other side by the rebel crowds. 109. The negotiations failed, as Richard was unwilling to come ashore and the rebels refused to enter discussions until he did. 109. Richard returned across the river to the Tower. Events in London. Entry to the city. The rebels began to cross from Southwark on to London, bridge on the afternoon of the 13th of June, 110, the defences on London Bridge were opened from the inside, either in sympathy for the rebel cause or out of fear, and the rebels advanced into the city. 111 NB8. At the same time, the rebel force from Essex made its way towards Aldgate on the north side of the city. 113. The rebels swept west through the centre of the city, and Aldgate was opened to let the rest of the rebels in. 114. The Kentish rebels had assembled a wide-ranging list of people whom they wanted the king to hand over for execution. 109. It included national figures, such as John of Gaunt, Archbishop, Sudbury, and Hales. Other key members of the Royal Council, officials such as Belknap and Bampton, who had intervened in Kent, and other hated members of the wider royal circle. 109. When they reached the Marshalsea prison in Suffolk, they tore it apart. 115. By now, the Kent and Essex rebels had been joined by many rebellious Londoners. 116. The Fleet and Newgate prisons were attacked by the crowds, and the rebels also targeted houses belonging to Flemish immigrants. 117. On the north side of London, the rebels approached Smithfield and Clerkenwell Priory, the headquarters of the Knights Hospitaller, which was headed by Hales. 118. The priory was destroyed, along with the nearby manor. 118. Heading west along Fleet Street, the rebels attacked the Temple, a complex of legal buildings and offices owned by the Hospitallers. 119. The contents, books and paperwork, were brought out and burned in the street, and the buildings systematically demolished. 119. Meanwhile, John Fordham, the keeper of the Privy Seal and one of the men on the rebels' execution list, narrowly escaped when the crowds ransacked. Next to be attacked along Fleet Street was the Savoy Palace, a huge, luxurious building belonging to John of Gaunt. 120. According to the chronicler Henry Knighton, it contained such quantities of vessels and silver plate, without counting the parcel gilt and solid gold, that 5 carts would hardly suffice to carry them. Official estimates placed the value of the contents at around £10,000. 120. The interior was systematically destroyed by the rebels, who burnt the soft furnishings, smashed the precious metalwork, crushed the gems, set fire to the Duke's records, and threw the remains into the Thames and the city drains. 120. Almost nothing was stolen by the rebels, who declared themselves to be zealots for truth and justice, not thieves and robbers. 121. The remains of the building were then set alight. 122. In the evening, rebel forces gathered outside the Tower of London, from where the king watched the fires burning across the city, taking the Tower of London. And the morning of the 14th of June, the crowd continued west along the Thames, burning the houses of officials around Westminster and opening the Westminster prison. 124. They then moved back into central London, setting fire to more buildings and storming Newgate prison. 124. The hunt for Flemings continued, and those with Flemish-sounding accents were killed, including the royal advisor, Richard Lyons. 125. NB9. In one city ward, the bodies of 40 executed Flemings were piled up in the street, and at the church of St. Martin Vintry, popular with the Flemish, 35 of the community were killed. 127. Historian Rodney Hilton argues that these attacks may have been coordinated by the Weavers' Guilds of London, who were commercial competitors of the Flemish weavers. 128. Isolated inside the tower, the royal government was in a state of shock at the turn of events. 129. The king left the castle that morning and made his way to negotiate with the rebels at Mile End in East London, taking only a very small bodyguard with him. 130 The king left Sudbury and Hales behind in the Tower, either for their own safety or because Richard had decided it would be safer to distance himself from his unpopular ministers. 131 Along the way, several Londoners accosted the king to complain about alleged injustices. 132 It is uncertain who spoke for the rebels at Mile End, and Wat Tyler may not have been present on this occasion, but they appear to have put forward their various demands to the king, including the surrender of the hated officials on their lists for execution, the abolition of serfdom and unfree tenure, that there should be no law within the realm save the law of Winchester, and a general amnesty for the rebels. 133 It is unclear precisely what was meant by the law of Winchester, but it probably referred to the rebel ideal of self-regulating village communities. 134 NB 10 Richard issued charters announcing the abolition of serfdom, which immediately began to be disseminated around the country. 136 He declined to hand over any of his officials, apparently instead promising that he would personally implement any justice that was required. 137 While Richard was at Mile End, the Tower was taken by the rebels. 138 This force, separate from those operating under Tyler at Mile End, approached the castle, possibly in the late morning. 138 NB 11 The gates were opened to receive Richard on his return, and a crowd of around 400 rebels entered the fortress, encountering no resistance, possibly because the guards were terrified by them. 139 Once inside, the rebels began to hunt down their key targets, and found Archbishop Sudbury and Robert Hales in the chapel of the White Tower. 140 Along with William Appleton, John of Gaunt's physician, and John Legge, a royal sergeant, they were taken out to Tower Hill and beheaded. 140 Their heads were paraded around the city before being affixed to London Bridge. 141 The rebels found John of Gaunt's son, the future Henry IV, and were about to execute him as well, when John Ferrers, one of the royal guards, successfully interceded on his behalf. 142 The rebels also discovered Lady Joan and Joan Holland, Richard's sister, in the castle, but let them go unharmed after making fun of them. 143 The castle was thoroughly looted of armor and royal paraphernalia. 144 In the aftermath of the attack, Richard did not return to the Tower, but instead travelled from Mile End to the Great Wardrobe, one of his royal houses in Blackfriars, part of southwest London. 145 There he appointed the military commander Richard Fitzalan, the Earl of Arundel, to replace Sudbury as Chancellor, and began to make plans to regain an advantage over the rebels the following day. 146 Many of the Essex rebels now began to disperse, content with the king's promises, leaving Tyler and the Kentish forces the most significant faction in London. 147 Tyler's men moved around the city that evening, seeking out and killing John of Gaunt's employees, foreigners, and anyone associated with the legal system. On the 15th of June, the royal government and the remaining rebels, who were unsatisfied with the charters granted the previous day, agreed to meet at Smithfield, just outside the city walls. 149 London remained in confusion, with various bands of rebels roaming the city independently. 144 Richard prayed at Westminster Abbey before setting out for the meeting in the late afternoon. 150 The chroniclers' accounts of the encounter all vary on matters of detail, but agree on the broad sequence of events. 151 The king and his party at least 200 strong, and including men-at-arms, positioned themselves outside St. Bartholomew's Priory, to the east of Smithfield, and the thousands of rebels massed along the western end. 152 MB. 12 Richard probably called Tyler forwards from the crowd to meet him, and Tyler greeted the king with what the royal party considered excessive familiarity, terming Richard his brother and promising him his friendship. 154 Richard queried why Tyler and the rebels had not yet left London following the signing of the charters the previous day, but this brought an angry rebuke from Tyler, who requested that a further charter be drawn up. 155 The rebel leader rudely demanded refreshment, and, once this had been provided, attempted to leave. 156 An argument then broke out between Tyler and some of the royal servants. 156 The Lord Mayor of London, William Walworth, stepped forward to intervene. Tyler made some motion towards the king, and the royal soldiers leaped in. 157 Either Walworth or Richard ordered Tyler to be arrested. Tyler attempted to attack the mayor, and Walworth responded by stabbing Tyler. 156 Ralph Standish, a royal squire, then repeatedly stabbed Tyler with his sword, mortally injuring him. 158 The situation was now precarious, and violence appeared likely as the rebels prepared to unleash a volley of arrows. 158 Richard rode forward towards the crowd and persuaded them to follow him away from Smithfield to Clerkenwell Fields, diffusing the situation. 158 Walworth, meanwhile, began to regain control of the situation, backed by reinforcements from the city. 159 Tyler's head was cut off and displayed on a pole, and, with their leader dead and the royal government now backed by the London militia, the rebel movement began to collapse. 160 Richard promptly knighted Walworth and his leading supporters for their services. Wider revolt Eastern England. While the revolt was unfolding in London, John Raw led his force into Suffolk. 161 Raw had considerable influence over the development of the revolt across eastern England, where there may have been almost as many rebels as in the London revolt. 162 The authorities put up very little resistance to the revolt. The major nobles failed to organize defenses. Key fortifications fell easily to the rebels, and the local militias were not mobilized. 163 As in London and the southeast, this was in part due to the absence of key military leaders and the nature of English law, but any locally recruited men might also have proved unreliable in the face of a popular uprising. 164 On the 12th of June, Raw attacked Sir Richard Lyon's property at Overhaul, advancing onto Cavendish and Bury St Edmunds in West Suffolk the next day, gathering further support as they went. 165 John Cambridge, the prior of the wealthy Bury St Edmunds Abbey, was disliked in the town, and Raw allied himself with the townspeople and stormed the abbey. 166 The prior escaped, but was found 2 days later and beheaded. 167 A small band of rebels marched north to Thetford to extort protection money from the town, and another group tracked down Sir John Cavendish, the Chief Justice of the King's Bench and Chancellor of the University of Cambridge. 168 Cavendish was caught in Lakenheath and killed. 169 John Battisford and Thomas Sampson independently led a revolt near Ipswich on the 14th of June. 170 They took the town without opposition and looted the properties of the archdeacon and local tax officials. 170 The violence spread out further, with attacks on many properties and the burning of the local court records. 171 One official, Edmund Lakenheath, was forced to flee from the Suffolk coast by boat. 172 revolt began to stir in St Albans in Hertfordshire late on the 13th of June, when news broke of the events in London. 173 There had been long-running disagreements in St Albans between the town and the local abbey, which had extensive privileges in the region. 174 On the 14th of June, protesters met with the abbot, Thomas de la Mare, and demanded their freedom from the abbey. 173 A group of townsmen under the leadership of William Grindercob travelled to London, where they appealed to the king for the rights of the abbey to be abolished. 175 Wat Tyler, then still in control of the city, granted them authority in the meantime to take direct action against the abbey. 176 Grindercob and the rebels returned to St Albans, where they found the prior had already fled. 177 broke out in Cambridgeshire, led by elements of Raw's Suffolk rebellion and some local men, such as John Greyston, who had been involved in the events in London and had returned to his home county to spread the revolt, and Geoffrey Cobb and John Hancock, members of the local gentry. 181 The University of Cambridge, staffed by priests and enjoying special royal privileges, was widely hated by the other inhabitants of the town. 181 A revolt backed by the mayor of Cambridge broke out with the university as its main target. 181 The rebels ransacked Corpus Christi College, which had connections to John of Gaunt and the university's church, and attempted to execute the university, Bedell, who escaped. 182 The university's library and archives were burned in the centre of the town, with one Marjorie Starr leading the mob in a dance to the rallying cry, "Away with the learning of clerks, away with it," while the documents burned. 183 The next day, the university was forced to negotiate a new charter, giving up its royal privileges. 184 Unrest then spread north from Cambridge toward Ely, where the prison was opened and the local justice of the peace executed. 185 In Norfolk, the revolt was led by Geoffrey Litster, a weaver, and Sir Roger Bacon, a local lord with ties to the Suffolk rebels. 186 Litster began sending out messengers across the county in a call to arms on the 14th of June, and isolated outbreaks of violence occurred. 187 The rebels assembled on the 17th of June outside Norwich and killed Sir Robert Sale, who was in charge of the city defences and had attempted to negotiate a settlement. 188 The people of the town then opened the gates to let the rebels in. 188 They began looting buildings and killed Reginald Eccles, a local official. 189 William D. Ufford, the Earl of Suffolk, fled his estates and travelled in disguise to London. 190 The other leading members of the local gentry were captured and forced to play out the roles of a royal household, working for Litster. 190 Violence spread out across the county as prisons were opened, Flemish immigrants killed, court records burned, and property looted and destroyed. Northern and Western England revolts also occurred across the rest of England, particularly in the cities of the north, traditionally centres of political unrest. 192 In the town of Beverley, violence broke out between the richer mercantile elite and the poorer townspeople during May. 193 By the end of the month, the rebels had taken power and replaced the former town administration with their own. 194 The rebels attempted to enlist the support of Alexander Neville, the Archbishop of York, and in June forced the former town government to agree to arbitration through Neville. 195 Peace was restored in June 1382. but tensions continued to simmer for many years. 196 word of the troubles in the southeast spread north, slowed by the poor communication links of medieval England. 197 in Leicester, where John of Gaunt had a substantial castle. Warnings arrived of a force of rebels advancing on the city from Lincolnshire, who were intent on destroying the castle and its contents. 197 The mayor and the town mobilized their defenses, including a local militia, but the rebels never arrived. 198 John of Gaunt was in Berwick when word reached him on 17 June of the revolt. 199 Not knowing that Wat Tyler had by now been killed, John of Gaunt placed his castles in Yorkshire and Wales on alert. 200 fresh rumours, many of them incorrect, continued to arrive in Berwick, suggesting widespread rebellions across the west and east of England and the looting of the ducal household in Leicester. Rebel units were even said to be hunting for the Duke himself. 200 Gaunt began to march to Bamburgh Castle, but then changed course and diverted north into Scotland, only returning south once the fighting was over. 201 news of the initial events in London also reached York around the 17th of June, and attacks at once broke out on the properties of the Dominican friars, the Franciscan friaries, and other religious institutions. 202 violence continued over the coming weeks, and on the 1st of July a group of armed men, under the command of John de Gisborne, forced their way into the city and attempted to seize control. 203 The mayor, Simon de Quixley, gradually began to reclaim authority, but order was not properly restored until 1382. 203 The news of the southern revolt reached Scarborough, where riots broke out against the ruling elite on the 23rd of June, with the rebels dressed in white hoods with a red tail at the back. 204 Members of the local government were deposed from office, and one tax collector was nearly lynched. 205 By 1382 the elite had re-established power. 206 In the Somerset town of Bridgewater, revolt broke out on the 19th of June, led by Thomas Ingleby and Adam Brugger. 207 The crowds attacked the local Augustine house and forced their master to give up his local privileges and pay a ransom. 208 The rebels then turned on the properties of John Sydenham, a local merchant and official, looting his manor and burning paperwork, before executing Walter Barron, a local man. 209 The Ilchester prison was stormed, and one unpopular prisoner executed. Suppression. The royal suppression of the revolt began shortly after the death of Wat Tyler on 15 June. Robert Knowles, Sir Nicholas Brember, and Sir Robert Laund were appointed to restore control in the capital. Summons was put out for soldiers. Probably around 4,000 men were mustered in London, and expeditions to the other troubled parts of the country soon followed. The revolt in East Anglia was independently suppressed by Henry Despenser, the Bishop of Norwich. Henry was in Stamford in Lincolnshire when the revolt broke out, and when he found out about it, he marched south with 8 men-at-arms and a small force of archers, gathering more forces as he went. He marched first to Peterborough, where he routed the local rebels and executed any he could capture, including some who had taken shelter in the local abbey. He then headed southeast via Huntingdon and Ely, reached Cambridge on the 19th of June, and then headed further into the rebel-controlled areas of Norfolk. Henry reclaimed Norwich on the 24th of June, before heading out with a company of men to track down the rebel leader, Geoffrey Lister. The two forces met at the Battle of North Walsham on the 25th or the 26th of June. The bishop's forces triumphed and Lister was captured and executed. Henry's quick action was essential to the suppression of the revolt in East Anglia, but he was very unusual in taking matters into his own hands in this way, and his execution of the rebels without royal sanction was illegal on the 17th of June. The king dispatched his half-brother Thomas Holland and Sir Thomas Trivet to Kent with a small force to restore order. They held courts at Maidstone and Rochester. 220 William de Ufford, the Earl of Suffolk, returned to his county on the 23rd of June, accompanied by a force of 500 men. He quickly subdued the area and was soon holding court in Milton, where many of the accused were sentenced to death. He moved on into Norfolk on the 6th of July, holding court in Norwich, Great Yarmouth and Hacking. Hugh, Lord Lazuch, led the legal proceedings against the rebels in Cambridgeshire. 220 in St. Albans. The abbot arrested William Grindecob and his main supporters on the 20th of June. The king's uncle, Thomas of Woodstock, and Robert Tressilian, the replacement Chief Justice, were given special commissions across the whole of England. Thomas oversaw court cases in Essex, backed up by a substantial military force, as resistance was continuing and the county was still in a state of unrest. Chartres himself visited Essex, where he met with a rebel delegation seeking confirmation of the grants the king had given at Mile End. Richard rejected them, allegedly telling them that rustics you were and rustics you are still. You will remain in bondage, not as before, but incomparably harsher. Tressilian soon joined Thomas and carried out 31 executions in Chelmsford, then travelled to St. Albans in July for further court trials, which appear to have utilised dubious techniques to ensure convictions. Thomas went on to Gloucester with 200 soldiers to suppress the unrest there. Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, was tasked to restore order to Yorkshire. A wide range of laws were invoked in the process of the suppression, from general treason to charges of book burning or demolishing houses, a process complicated by the relatively narrow definition of treason at the time. The use of informants and denunciations became common, causing fear to spread across the country. By November, at least 1,500 people had been executed or killed in battle. Many of those who had lost property in the revolt attempted to seek legal compensation, and John of Gaunt made particular efforts to track down those responsible for destroying his Savoy palace. Most had only limited success, as the defendants were rarely willing to attend court. Last of these cases was resolved in 1387. The rebel leaders were quickly rounded up. A rebel leader by the name of Jack Straw was captured in London and executed. John Ball was caught in Coventry, tried in St. Albans and executed on the 15th of July. Grindecob was also tried and executed in St. Albans. John Raw was tried in London. He probably gave evidence against 24 of his colleagues in the hope of a pardon, but was sentenced to be executed by being hanged. Drawn and quartered on the 6th of May, 1382. Sir Roger Bacon was probably arrested before the final battle in Norfolk, and was tried and imprisoned in the Tower of London before finally being pardoned by the Crowners of September 1381. Thomas Ingleby of Bridgewater had successfully evaded the authorities. Although women such as Johanna Ferrua played a prominent role in the revolt, no evidence has been found of women being executed or punished as harshly as their male counterparts. After Mather, royal government and parliament began to re-establish the normal processes of government after the revolt. As the historian Michael Poston describes, the uprising was in many ways a passing episode. On the 30th of June, the king ordered England's serfs to return to their previous conditions of service, and on the 2nd of July, the royal charters signed under duress during the rising were formally revoked. Parliament met in November to discuss the events of the year and how best to respond to their challenges. The revolt was blamed on the misconduct of royal officials who, it was argued, had been excessively greedy and overbearing. The Commons stood behind the existing labour laws, but requested changes in the royal council, which Richard granted. Richard also granted general pardons to those who had executed rebels without due process, to all men who had remained loyal, and to all those who had rebelled, with the exception of the men of Bury St. Edmunds, any men who had been involved in the killing of the king's advisers, and those who were still on the run from prison despite the violence of the suppression. The government and local lords were relatively circumspect in restoring order after the revolt, and continued to be worried about fresh revolts. For several decades, few lords took revenge on their peasants except through the legal processes of the court's low level. Unrest continued for several more years. In September 1382 there was trouble in Norfolk involving an apparent plot against the Bishop of Norwich, and in March the following year there was an investigation into a plot to kill the Sheriff of Devon. When negotiating rents with their landlords, peasants alluded to the memory of the revolt and the threat of violence. There were no further attempts by Parliament to impose a poll tax or to reform England's fiscal system. The Commons instead concluded at the end of 1381 that the military effort on the continent should be carefully but substantially reduced. Unable to raise fresh taxes, the government had to curtail its foreign policy and military expeditions, and began to examine the options for peace. The institution of serfdom declined after 1381, but primarily for economic rather than political reasons. Rural wages continued to increase, and lords increasingly sold their serfs freedom in exchange for cash, or converted traditional forms of tenure to new leasehold arrangements. During the 15th century, serfdom vanished in England. Rebels chroniclers primarily described the rebels as rural serfs, using broad, derogatory Latin terms such as servals, rusti, servile genus, and rusticitatus. 255 Some chroniclers, including Knighton, also noted the presence of runaway apprentices, artisans, and others, sometimes terming them the lesser commons. 255 The evidence from the court records following the revolt, albeit biased in various ways, similarly shows the involvement of a much broader community, and the earlier perception that the rebels were only constituted of unfree serfs is now rejected. 256 NB 15 The rural rebels came from a wide range of backgrounds, but typically they were, as the historian Christopher Dyer describes, people well below the ranks of the gentry, but who mainly held some land and goods, and not the very poorest in society, who formed a minority of the rebel movement. 258 Many had held positions of authority in local village governance, and these seem to have provided leadership to the revolt. 259 Some were artisans, including, as the historian Rodney Hilton lists, carpenters, sawyers, masons, cobblers, tailors, weavers, fullers, glovers, hosiers, skinners, bakers, butchers, innkeepers, cooks, and a lime burner. 260 They were predominantly male, but with some women in their ranks. 261 The rebels were typically illiterate. Only between 5 and 15% of England could read during this period. 262 They also came from a broad range of local communities, including at least 330 southeastern villages. 263 Many of the rebels had urban backgrounds, and the majority of those involved in the events of London were probably local townsfolk rather than peasants. 264 In some cases, the townsfolk who joined the revolt were the urban poor, attempting to gain at the expense of the local elites. 265 In London, for example, the urban rebels appear to have largely been the poor and unskilled. 128 Other urban rebels were part of the elite, such as at York, where the protesters were typically prosperous members of the local community, while in some instances, townsfolk allied themselves with the rural population, as at Bury St Edmunds. 266 In other cases, such as Canterbury, the influx of population from the villages following the Black Death made any distinction between urban and rural less meaningful. 267 With the peasants' revolt marking the revolution of the freedom fight, labour had become so expensive that the feudal system was ultimately coming to an end. 268 The rebels of the peasants' revolt were represented by various writers since they did not represent themselves in historical records. 269 The distortion of written records implied that these rebels were illiterate or otherwise incoherent. 269 Some of these distortions made by countless authors were also interpretative and favoured their own positions, making the job of historians more difficult as they try to uncover a more truthful representation of the rebels. 269 Author and medievalist Stephen Justice exemplifies that the rebels were, in fact, capable of speech and language at its most developed. 270 examples of this included cultural forms of expression such as rituals, performances, and literary texts. 270 The vast majority of those involved in the revolt of 1381 were not represented in Parliament and were excluded from its decision-making. 271 In a few cases, the rebels were led or joined by relatively prosperous members of the gentry, such as Sir Roger Bacon in Norfolk. 272 Some of them later claimed to have been forced to join the revolt by the rebels. 273 Clergy also formed part of the revolt, as well as the more prominent leaders, such as John Ball or John Raw. Nearly 20 are mentioned in the records of the revolt in the southeast. 274 Some were pursuing local grievances. Some were disadvantaged and suffering relative poverty, and others appear to have been motivated by strong, radical beliefs. 225 Many of those involved in the revolt used pseudonyms, particularly in the letters sent around the country to encourage, support, and fresh uprisings. 276 They were used both to avoid incriminating particular individuals and to allude to popular values and stories. 277 One popular assumed name was Piers Plowman, taken from the main character in William Langland's poem. 278 Jack was also a widely used rebel pseudonym, and historians Stephen Justice and Carter Rivard suggest that this may have been because it resonated with the Jacques of the French Jacquerie revolts several decades earlier. Legacia historiographic contemporary chroniclers of the events in the revolt have formed an important source for historians. The chroniclers were biased against the rebel cause and typically portrayed the rebels, in the words of the historian Susan Crane, as beasts, monstrosities, or misguided fools. 281 London chroniclers were also unwilling to admit the role of ordinary Londoners in the revolt, preferring to place the blame entirely on rural peasants from the southeast. Among the key accounts was the anonymous Anomaly Chronicle, whose author appears to have been part of the royal court and an eyewitness to many of the events in London. 282 The chronicler Thomas Walsingham was present for much of the revolt, but focused his account on the terror of the social unrest and was extremely biased against the rebels. 283 The events were, recorded in France by Jean Froissart, the author of the Chronicles. 284 He had well-placed sources close to the revolt, but was inclined to elaborate the known facts with colourful stories. 285 No sympathetic accounts of the rebels survive. 4. For centuries, chroniclers and historians of the revolt were overwhelmingly negative, but attitudes started to change in the 18th century as serfdom was long rejected, and in the aftermath of the radicalism associated with the French Revolution. 286 At the end of the 19th century, there was a surge in historical interest in the peasants' revolt, spurred by the contemporary growth of the labour and socialist movements. 287 Work by Charles Oman, Edgar Powell, André Reville, and Gimd Extravillian established the course of the revolt. 288 By 1907, the accounts of the chroniclers were all widely available in print, and the main public records concerning the events had been identified. 289 Reville began to use the legal indictments that had been used against suspected rebels after the revolt as a fresh source of historical information, and over the next century extensive research was carried out into the local economic and social history of the revolt, using scattered local sources across southeast England. 290 Interpretations of the revolt have changed over the years. Historians of the 17th century, such as John Smythe, established the idea that the revolt had marked the end of unfree labour and serfdom in England. 280 historians of the 19th century, such as William Stubbs and Thorold Rogers, reinforced this conclusion, Stubbs describing it as one of the most portentous events in the whole of our history. 280 In the 20th century, this interpretation was increasingly challenged by historians such as May McKissick, Michael Poston, and Richard Dobson, who revised the impact of the revolt on further political and economic events in England. 291 Mid-20th century Marxist historians were both interested in and generally sympathetic to the rebel cause, a trend culminating in Hilton's 1973 account of the uprising, set against the wider context of peasant revolts across Europe during the period. 292 The Peasants' Revolt has received more academic attention than any other medieval revolt, and this research has been interdisciplinary, involving historians, literary scholars, and international collaboration. 293a Large slate memorial to the Great Rising was commissioned by Matthew Bell and carved by Emily Hoff. It was unveiled by the film director Ken Loach in Smithfield on the 15th of July 2015. The Peasants' Revolt became a popular literary subject. 295 The poet John Gower, who had close ties to officials involved in the suppression of the revolt, amended his famous poem Vox Clementis after the revolt, inserting a section condemning the rebels and likening them to wild animals. 296 Geoffrey Chaucer, who lived in Aldgate and may have been in London during the revolt, used the rebel killing of Flemings as a metaphor for wider disorder in the nuns, priests, tale part of the Canterbury Tales, parodying Gower's poem. 297-298 Although the Peasants' Revolt was only ever mentioned sparingly in Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, the Peasants' Revolt was one of the many historical incidents that occurred in Chaucer's life prior to his popular works. 268 With other events such as the Black Death, the devastation that followed after the plague incited the peasants that survived to seek a better quality of life. 270 Evidence of the impression that the revolt made on Chaucer can be seen in the Miller's prologue of the Canterbury Tales. Chaucer portrays the miller as someone who is not entirely satisfied with the typical idea of what a peasant is and how they should live. and he uses metaphors in order to make this implication in the Miller's Prologue. 270. The notion that the miller is able to tell a tale that can match, or is the revolt, formed the basis for the late 16th century play, The Life and Death of Jack Straw, possibly written by George Peele, and probably originally designed for production in the city's guild pageants. It portrays Jack Straw as a tragic figure being led into wrongful rebellion by John Ball, making clear political links between the instability of late Elizabethan England and the 14th century. The story of the revolt was used in pamphlets during the English Civil War of the 17th century and formed part of John Cleveland's early history of the war. It was deployed as a cautionary account in political speeches during the 18th century, and a chapbook entitled The History of Wat, Tyler and Jack Straw proved popular during the Jacobite Risings and American War of Independence. The historian James Crossley argues that after the French Revolution, the peasants' revolt was seen more positively, especially among radicals and revolutionaries. 305. Thomas Paine and Edmund Burke argued over the lessons to be drawn from the revolt. Paine expressing sympathy for the rebels and Burke condemning the violence. The Romantic poet Robert Southey based his 1794 play Wat Tyler on the events, taking a radical and pro-rebel perspective, as the historian Michael Poston describes. The revolt became famous as a landmark in social development and a typical instance of working-class revolt against oppression, and was widely used in 19th and 20th century socialist literature. William Morris built on Chaucer in his novel A Dream of John Ball, published in 1888, creating a narrator who was openly sympathetic to the peasant cause. Albeit a 19th century persona taken back to the 14th century by a dream, the story ends with a prophecy that socialist ideals will one day be successful. In turn, this representation of the revolt influenced Maurice's utopian socialist News from Nowhere. Florence Converse used the revolt in her novel Long Will in 1903. Later 20th century socialists continued to draw parallels between the revolt and contemporary political struggles, including during the arguments over the introduction of the community charge in the United Kingdom during the 1980s. Conspiracy theorists, including writer John Robinson, have attempted to explain alleged flaws in mainstream historical accounts of the events of 1381, such as the speed with which the rebellion was coordinated. Theories include that the revolt was led by a secret occult organization called the Great Society, said to be an offshoot of the Order of the Knights Templar destroyed in 1312, or that the Fraternity of the Freemasons was covertly involved in organizing the revolt. Freedom and slavery, the birth of capital love, all the catchwords used by capital's paid and unpaid defenders. Freedom is surely the most used and the least understood. Capitalism is freedom according to Turning Point UK. Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom remains a holy text for those faithful to the Church of Free Enterprise. In fact, it is impossible even to begin a discussion on the nature of capitalism without hearing individual freedom, free choice, free trade or free markets. The more individuals are left to trade and enrich themselves, the more capitalism thrives, and consequently, the more free and prosperous everyone in society becomes. This argument is simple, familiar, and completely false. In reality, capitalist freedom has always had a deeply contradictory nature from the very beginning. What the birth of capital required was that the owners of money, land and industry should be confronted by a mass of free workers, liberated from any property of their own and completely reliant on the market. This is the real foundation of the capitalist system, and its history is written in the annals of mankind in letters of blood and fire. In the words of Karl Marx, the decline of feudalism was amongst the crumbling ruins of feudal Europe that the foundations for a new social order were laid. But the first blows against the old order were struck neither by the merchants nor the money-lenders, but by the poorest and most oppressed layer in feudal Europe, the serfs. Medieval Europe was built on the unpaid labor of this class of semi-slaves, who were granted a small patch of land in return for which they were forced to work for free on the estates of the church, and feudal nobility for several days a week. Added to this was boon work or corvée, which required the serfs to perform specific tasks for the benefit of their lords. In England at the time of the Doomsday Book 1086, it is estimated that as much as 70% of the population were classed as serfs. It is in the struggle of this oppressed class of peasants to free themselves from bondage that the prehistory of capitalism can be traced. There is an old German saying, Stadtluft macht frei, which means town air makes you free. Its source is a customary law from the Middle Ages under which any escaped serfs who remained in a town for a year and a day would no longer be subject to the claims of their former lords and hence would become free. But this custom did not simply descend from heaven or come about by a gentleman's agreement between the rulers and their slaves. It was the product of years of bitter class struggle. A serf was considered a part of the lord's property, as if he and his family had grown out of the soil itself. He was consequently completely under the jurisdiction of his lord, meaning he had little opportunity to seek justice from anyone else. The king was himself just another landlord, and the church was the biggest landlord of all. The easiest and most effective defense against the lord's exploitation was flight, and throughout the medieval period a constant struggle thundered between serfs, striving to escape the snatching grasp of the lords and their manhunters who roved the country in search of their lost property. One result of this clash was many of the free towns of Europe. These ramshackle settlements, from such humble beginnings, would in some cases become powerful independent cities born out of feudalism, and yet in opposition to it, the town dwellers, known in France as bourgeois, organized themselves into city councils and guilds, which served as local organs of power through which these collection of individuals, thrown together by common struggle, would be transformed into a class. The growth of these towns and the rapid rise in population up to the Black Death contributed to a powerful upturn in trade, which began gradually to undermine the foundations of feudalism. Engels remarks that long before the ramparts of the baronial castles were breached by the new artillery, they had already been undermined by money in his article, The Decline of Feudalism and the Rise of the Bourgeoisie. As early as the Crusades, some lords were beginning to demand money rents from their subjects in place of labor services, so that they could access the various luxuries and exotic products this trade brought into view. But the more the lords exacted money rents from their tenants, the more both parties became dependent on the towns. Previously, the feudal manor had been a self-sufficient unit, combining both handicrafts and agriculture. The growth of the towns brought with it more specialized products, such as tools and cloth, for the masses as well as silks for the nobility. From this growing division of labor sprang a new relationship between the rural peasants and the bourgeois in the Towner relationship, mediated through commodities. The 14th century represents a point of no return in the struggle against serfdom, which was already in decline in most of Europe. Rather than strengthening the lords against the peasantry, the crisis caused by the Black Death, which reduced the population of Europe by at least a third, actually gave the peasants themselves a great deal of bargaining power. The response of the lords was to try to impose a legal maximum on the wages of labourers and to crush the peasantry with taxation, of which the poll tax was the most infamous example. The result was the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, which, allied with the poorest layer of the London masses, took the form of a national uprising. Despite its brutal suppression, this revolutionary movement succeeded on two fronts. There was no further levying of the poll tax until Thatcher's ill-fated attempt to resurrect it, and serfdom in England was dead. In its place was an exhausted nobility increasingly dependent on money rent, independent smallholding peasants, and a growing bourgeoisie in the towns. Engels remarks that in history the actions of the men and women who make history ultimately have consequences quite other than those intended. The struggle of the peasants and town dwellers had set the stage for a dramatic new act in world history. But no sooner had their freedom been won, so began a new wave of enslavement out of the fruits of their victory. The world market, the decline of feudalism, gave a powerful spur to the production and exchange of commodities. The developing division of labor between the craft industry in the towns and rural agriculture created an expanding demand for goods of all kinds, and this demand was fed by an increasingly complex and powerful web of commercial routes across Europe and the Mediterranean. First in Egypt, then taken up by the Italian city-states. Sophisticated legal instruments such as insurance contracts and trading companies were introduced to cover the risks associated with regular long-distance trade, and along with the growing power of the merchants came the rise of that common whore of mankind, money. The founding of merchant banks in the great trading cities of Italy, such as Venice, originally as a response to the needs of merchant capital, would then act back on this development, pushing it to greater heights. By the 15th century, the burgeoning commodity economy in Europe was straining against what appeared to be a natural limit. The production and exchange of greater and greater masses of commodities created a dire need for money as a means of circulation and payment. Further, producers of much sought-after luxuries in Asia would often only take payment in silver, having no need for European cloth. The growing thirst for precious metals to feed the developing market could not be quenched by the relatively scanty produce of European mines. The result was the infamous gold lust that drove European adventurers on a quest of global pillage. We now call the Age of Discovery. One particularly quaint myth associated with this period is that it came about as a result of some uniquely European spirit of inquiry and adventure. This would certainly come as a surprise to the Chinese and Arab explorers of the period. But Engels offers us the swiftest rebuttal of this romantic nonsense. Everywhere the Europeans landed, they discovered new wealth to bring home to sell at an enormous profit. Like old Midas, whatever they touched turned to gold, with calamitous results for the native peoples they encountered. Marx remarks in Capital, Volume 3 that merchants' capital, when it holds a position of dominance, stands everywhere for a system of robbery, so that its development among the trading nations of old and modern times is always directly connected with plundering, piracy, kidnapping, slaves, and colonial conquest. Nowhere can this be more clearly seen than in the period following the discovery of the New World. On the 3rd of August 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed out of the Spanish port of Palos. His goal was to reach Asia by sailing west over the Atlantic. Instead, on the 12th of October he stumbled upon the Bahamas and a people called, in their own language, the Luku. In his diary, Columbus wrote, "Historians estimate there were 1 million Tainos, of which the Luku were part. In 1492, 56 years later, there were only 500. This became a model for the colonization of the rest of the Americas. Wiped out by unfamiliar diseases, sometimes deliberately sent to an early death in poisonous mines. Almost 100 million human beings were sacrificed at the altar of commerce. The price of their lives was the 100,000 metric tons of silver exported to Europe from Latin America between 1492 and 1800. Then, as now, defenders of this genocide pointed to the benefits of European freedom that were being forcibly administered to the natives. One such pious servant of God, Archbishop Ligon y Cisneros, explained, "But these European liberators didn't just free the indigenous population of their lives and treasure. Each site of human sacrifice became a fresh link in the chain of the growing world market, demanding an intensification of production by the most barbaric means. As the native population of the Caribbean dwindled, it was replaced by African slaves and sugar plantations, first trialed by the Portuguese on Cape Verde. Rather than developing production on a higher level, the original achievement of the world market was to extend and intensify the slavery of old on an ever-expanding scale. By the end of the slave trade in 1853, between 12 and 15 million Africans had been transported, of whom as many as 2.4 million died en route. This horrific slaughter was an integral part of the early development of capitalism. This was not lost on Marx, who emphasized in capital volume 1, and yet this period confronts us in one respect as an immense contradiction. On the one hand, we see a developing world market with the ever-expanding production and exchange of commodities, but, on the other, the methods used to produce these commodities remain nothing more than the intensification of pre-existing forms of exploitation to an agonizing pitch. Capitalism without commodities or money is unimaginable, but these still do not equate to capitalist production. What is required is for labor power, the ability of human beings to work, to itself become a commodity. This final, decisive stage in the birth of the capitalist system took the form of an immense social revolution which began in England in the 16th century. The Agrarian Revolution in 1516. The famous Tudor lawyer and writer Thomas More observed, what he was describing was a revolution waged by the rich against their own people. The end of serfdom had dealt a heavy blow to the power of the lords, but they still retained ownership of great swathes of land. It was from this position that the old masters began their counteroffensive against the free peasants of England. The expansion of trade in the 14th century had also created a growing demand for wool, of which England was a major exporter. In response to this demand, landlords began forcibly evicting their feudal tenants in order to convert entire villages into sheep. The importance of this lucrative trade for the English nobility can even be seen today in the woolsack upon which the Lord Speaker still sits in the House of Lords. The result of this barefaced robbery was on the dispossession of thousands of peasants, many of whom had no choice but to roam the land looking for work or charity. The problem had already become so widespread that in 1489 Henry VII passed the first of a series of acts which sought to curtail the depopulation of the countryside. The discovery of the Americas and the gigantic upswing in trade that came with it only added fuel to the fire. Throughout the Tudor period, agricultural production was shifted towards cash crops for the market, with a new breed of capitalist farmers employing landless paupers as laborers. Even this new mode of production proved insufficient to soak up the flood of poverty. However, eventually, the class of pauperized vagabonds became so large that it caused Queen Elizabeth I to introduce a special poor rate. as early as 1601, whilst at the same time providing for unlicensed beggars to be executed without mercy as felons. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the expropriation and displacement of the rural masses took on an official form through the passing of a series of enclosure acts in Parliament. This was catastrophic for the rural population. It had effectively driven the English peasantry to extinction by the 19th century, but it provided an enormous army of propertyless labourers for the growing industries in and around the towns. It was this process of legalised theft that gave birth to the capitalist property rights, so admired by modern defenders of capitalism, the state. Another myth that surrounds the birth of capitalism is that it was achieved by the pioneering economic activity of enterprising individuals, in opposition to the dead hand of the state. This fairy tale is regularly dusted off whenever the modern state is forced to pass reforms by the pressure of the workers, but nothing could be further from the truth. At all points, our future captains of industry and commerce depended on the most brutal state repression to protect their class interests. Absolutism arose out of the contradictions of dying feudal society, a feudal monarchy resting alternately on landowners, bourgeois and peasantry. With one hand it placed checks on the expropriation of the peasantry, but with another, usually acting in its own interests, actually hastened the development of capitalism. The sale of lands expropriated from the church after the Reformation at cut-down prices, for example, was an enormous gift to the nascent capitalist farmers of the 16th century. Likewise, the establishment of colonial monopolies by all the absolutist monarchies of Western Europe provided essential protection for the early development of manufacture. However, precisely because of its transitional and contradictory nature, at a certain point, this form of the state comes into a stark conflict with the interests of the bourgeoisie. Once the bourgeois had seized economic dominance, it must be able to rule in its own interests, and so the last vestige of the feudal political system became just another fetter on the great drive for accumulation which was taking root. Beginning with the Dutch War of Independence, a wave of revolutions swept Europe as the bourgeoisie took the road to political power. In its struggle against the old order, it united all that was healthy and progressive in society behind its call for liberty. Sweeping away the particularism of the past, the revolutionaries cleared the way for the development of a truly national market. In place of the arbitrary privileges of absolutism, they demanded the rule of law, which in practice has always meant the rule of the bourgeoisie. But the great and tragic contradiction of all these movements lay in the fact that, as in the English Revolution, they ultimately delivered power not to the peasants and artisans who formed the Ironsides of the revolutionary armies, but a new, even more powerful class of exploiters, something our modern lovers of liberty tend to forget. Following the burial of absolutism, the state came fully into the possession of the new landed aristocracy, bankocracy and large manufacturers, either in the form of a republic or more commonly a constitutional, that is, tame monarchy. Anyone who doubts the significance of this for the development of capitalism need only look at the measures taken by the English Parliament after the so-called Glorious Revolution. In 1688, enclosures were transformed from a widespread abuse to a deliberate policy. The Bank of England was created along with the national debt, a debt to none other than capitalist speculators. Further legislation to impose a maximum wage was imposed, while combinations of workers to negotiate better pay and conditions were, of course, forbidden. The concentrated power of the state was used to hasten hothouse fashion, the process of transformation of the feudal mode of production into the capitalist mode. And to shorten the transition, Marx writes in Capital Volume 1, adding, "It might also be noted that in this golden age of liberty and enlightenment, not a single worker or poor peasant had either a vote or political representation in any form. In reality, the rising capitalist, landowners and manufacturers needed the power of the state to regulate wages and lengthen the working day. In fact, it is only when their own miniature tyranny in the workplace is secured that the capitalist class will tolerate any political freedoms on the part of the workers, and even then, these are to be limited so as not to infringe upon their sacred right to private property, that is, the fruit of centuries of theft, the birth of the working class. The development of society is in the last instance determined by the development of humanity's productive forces, but on its own technology is incapable of changing society. It is itself socially determined. The ancient Greeks had discovered steam power long before bourgeois Europe. Even the German inventor Anton Müller produced a loom capable of weaving several pieces of cloth at the same time as early as 1529. The result was not the Industrial Revolution but, on the contrary, the murder of the inventor by the local city council. In England, the agrarian and political revolutions of the 16th and 17th centuries laid the basis for the Industrial Revolution. Without the creation of a surplus population of proletarians, the rising productivity of agriculture, and the gigantic boons granted to the capitalists by their conquest of political power, such an enormous social transformation would have been unthinkable. The newly created proletariat was quickly put to work, usually under the whip of brutal repression. But one more obstacle to the unfettered freedom of capitalist exploitation remained. The guilds, by imposing strict rules and restrictions on the industry, the guild system, which was itself a product of the struggle of the early bourgeoisie, became a suffocating fetter on the free development of the capitalist mode of production. In fact, the first manufacture of woolen cloth recorded in 16th century was shut down by the local guilds precisely because it threatened their monopoly. The first cotton spinning mill was actually set up outside of any major town, in Royton, Lancashire, in order to avoid the resistance of what remained of the guilds in 1764. This quickly established a pattern for what would become the factory system. As one writer noted in 1773, here lies the secret of capital, not private enterprise, but the sweated labor of others, not property rights, but the absence of property for the many. Eventually, the wage limitations which had been in place for centuries were finally repealed in 1813. They were now an absurd anomaly, according to Marx, as the capitalists could freely dictate their workers' wages and conditions as they pleased. The advance of capitalist production, helped by the mailed fist of the state, had finally developed a working class which, by education, tradition and habit, looks upon the requirements of that mode of production as self-evident natural laws, as this newer, more civilized form of exploitation took over more and more spheres of production. The British ruling class suddenly discovered that the slaves working its colonial plantations were human beings too. But when it finally abolished slavery in its colonies in 1833, the British government paid out 20 meters to compensate not the slaves, but the 3,000 families that had owned slaves for their loss of property. This figure represented in today's terms around £16.5 billion, an enormous gift to the slave owners, which they promptly put to use in English factories, Irish farms, and Indian plantations. Slavery was not abolished because it was immoral. It was abolished because it was unprofitable. It would be foolish to persist in such an expensive and unproductive enterprise when a shrewd investor could squeeze a never-before-seen profit from the blood of the freeborn slaves of Britain and its colonies. But the creation of the working class gave a double gift to the capitalists. Not only did it create their profits from the workers' surplus labor, it also created the means by which those profits could be realized, the first ever truly mass consumer market. The average peasant never tended to buy much food or clothing because he would grind his own corn and weave his own cloth. The dispossession of the peasantry meant that not only were they dependent on the capitalists for work and wages, they also had to spend those wages on basic necessities like food and clothing from none other than the same capitalists looked at on a national scale. Later, in the 19th century, the British state used tariffs to destroy the Indian homespinning industry and flood the market with cloth, often spun from Indian cotton. The role of India as a colony thus shifted from solely being a source of loot, which it remained, to also being an enormous captive market. In this way, the Indian masses, like their British counterparts, paid twice for their exploitation by the British capitalists. This played an important role both in the rise of British capitalism and the struggle for Indian independence. In 1921, the Indian National Congress adopted a flag containing a picture of a spinning wheel to symbolize the home industry destroyed by British-rigged competition. This spinning wheel still survives in part in the Indian flag today, although it was changed into a Buddhist chakra wheel. The importance of mass consumption to capitalism can be seen today on an even grander scale. The effect of this in our culture is the rampant consumerism and debt which bears down on us as individuals like a force of nature. We must not only work, we must buy. In this sense, supply determines demand as much as demand determines supply. A new fight capital now emerged, fully formed and dripping blood from every pore, to use Marx's expression. Ever since, the freedom of capital has continued to find its reflection and source in the unfreedom of human beings, but it has also laid the basis for a new and greater fight, just as the bourgeoisie, a class born of the struggle between the feudal lords and serfs, was eventually able to seize power, transform the state to its own ends, and wield it to eliminate the old order. So too can the working class, itself created by capitalism's infinite drive to exploit human labor power. Like the medieval serfs, the workers of today give up most of their lives for a parasitic class of property owners. But by taking the immense productive forces created by their own labor into the hands of society as a whole, the workers of the world can put an end to class oppression for good, and usher in a new era of genuine freedom for the whole of the human race.